All right, well, thank you again, everyone, for being here today. And I'd like to thank the congregation for excellent lunch and excellent conversation. And I feel like this day is going by very quickly. Hopefully, it's sort of the same for you, but it's but anyway, again, really appreciate the opportunity to speak on this topic. And so, many things we could talk about. Well, we'll be doing initially, I'll start out with just a few slides on the origin of the universe, and then we'll talk some about the flood and the fossil record, and then again as Derek mentioned, we'll take just kind of a stretch our legs break, and then we'll get into radiometric dating and radiocarbon dating, kind of for the a little bit later in the afternoon. So I wanted to start out talking about the origin of the universe, and this is one where again. There's a lot of, I guess, just say fake science out there, and almost science that we know isn't true, and atheists and Christians both know it's not true. But it's kind of the way I almost like to phrase it is it's the best the atheists can come up with, and so for whatever reason that's still dominating. Again, a lot of our public schools and museums and just anywhere you look, publications, movie specials. So again, I want to talk about that, and so hopefully again want to. Make this useful, and so try to I'll try to stop, ask for questions, and really just make sure that you're comfortable. If someone starts wanting to talk about this subject, and just and again, depending on what their specific interest in or what details they want, there's a lot of great information at that Apologetics Press website that's up on the screen. And then and again, please feel free to email me anytime if I can ever try to help as well. So let's start out talking about how true science is the Christian's friend, and as true science advances, it always confirms the Bible. So there's a publication in the United States called the Wall Street Journal. I'm not sure if anyone's heard of it before, but it's actually it's a reputable newspaper. They try to be accurate. But also in the United States, at the end of each year, so say it's middle of December or so, well, everybody starts to say, well, what's the biggest story of the past year? What are some of the really big news things that happened over the previous year? And so in this case, in 1907, they said, well, here's the biggest story of the past year. And it says the most extraordinary event of the past 12 months was the proof afforded by astronomical observations that conscious, intelligent human life exists upon the planet Mars. And I'm like, wow, that'd be pretty big. I can see why they said that. So that's 1907. Again, our science, our knowledge of Mars was very, very little. And what had happened was, if you see that picture on the upper left, people were starting to observe Mars, and there were a few people, they were very rich, well-educated, and so they would do things like they would send large telescopes to places. The Atacama Desert in Chile, for example, is a very good place to do astronomical observations. And so, but they started to say, well, it looks like there's canals on Mars. If you ever get a chance to look at Mars through a telescope, it's fascinating. You can see features on the surface. I'm not sure how they came up with canals, but they say, okay, you can see. So they thought they could see canals on Mars, and so they developed this whole theory of how there was a civilization on Mars, and it was trying to get water from the ice cap. You can see the ice caps on Mars really well in a large telescope, and so but they were, they had this whole story. I think the word fairy tale was used earlier, about this struggling civilization on Mars, and it was trying to get water from the poles, but what happened was, again, this was Percival Lowell. He was the one who had apparently funded the study where they sent a team, and they told the team to observe the canals on Mars. Now that sounds subtle, but if you're doing scientific investigation, we'll talk a lot more about that when we're talking about fossils. You don't phrase the question like that. If you really wanted objective science, they would have said, here, I'm going to send a large telescope with you. You're going to go down to the Atacama Desert. I want you to observe Mars and tell me what you see. But that's not what he told them. He said he wanted, observe the canals on Mars. So, and so again, he's a Harvard University graduate, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He was very wealthy, so he's able to personally finance that team. So that contributed a lot to that story. And then, at that time, like the French Academy of Science and others, they were convinced that the Martian civilization was an established fact. There's even writings from back then where people were offering say $1 million or $1 million equivalent for evidence of civilizations in the universe, but except Mars. It had to be beyond Mars because everybody knew there was one on Mars. Okay, so it was it's just that whole environment. It's in a lot of ways analogous to what we're in today. It's all imagined, but it was almost just accepted fact. Evolution was considered, true. Life, around the universe was considered true. And then, of course, so I always wonder if I'd been sitting in class and someone had come in and, put the Wall Street Journal down in front of me and said, well, what do you think about that? And that's a lot of times as Christians, we get in that kind of a situation. So we have to be careful how we respond because we want to really see about what's being said. Sometimes it contradicts the Bible. A lot of times it doesn't contradict the Bible. So we have to be just really thoughtful of what we say. Because, of course, if someone had been too rash to say, oh, well, okay, that's fine, their civilization is on Mars. But then when we think about it, there would have been a lot of contradictions with the Bible, everything from, why did Jesus come to Earth? If there's also men on Mars, if God didn't create men on Mars, then did they go there before the flood? Well, if they went there before the flood, then could they escape God's judgment? I mean, so been opened up a whole, so that's just one thing. But I always just wondered, because you wonder how many Christians that happened to. They were apparently already evolutionists, already atheists, and if they got in this big discussion, well, wow, the Wall Street Journal, who's going to argue with that? So this belief that higher life forms exist on Mars is widespread through the 1950s. This was Collier's magazine. Again, it was just it's talking about human Mars missions. People have been thinking about going to Mars for a long time. Is there life on Mars? Walt Disney is talking to people at lunch had been to Walt Disney World, and but again, Walt Disney was very fascinated in this subject. So he would do specials. If you go back, I think a lot of them are on YouTube. But a lot of them would say like, the question is, are there intelligent life on Mars, or is it just animals, or just for plants and animals? And of course, so then true science keeps advancing. So we landed a probe, or we sent a probe to Mars in 1965, and it looked really barren. Okay, so then we land on Mars. This is a picture of the Viking lander, 1978. Nothing there. It's really desolate, and couldn't. Again, just no sign of anything. Right now there's a rover on Mars. It has the helicopter. You may have been seeing something. Again, it's just we know there's no life on Mars. Now it's still sold as an idea, but you think about it. It went from again, major newspaper saying proof of intelligent human life on Mars in 1907 till now when, by any objective reasoning, there's no life on Mars. And so that's true science advancing. And of course, that's exactly what we would expect from the Bible. It's fully consistent with the Bible. So it's, again, just interesting to see the history, because a lot of times it's easy to see history when we look back on it. We look back at a 1907 Wall Street Journal article saying there's humans on Mars, and we can kind of chuckle. Wow, how could they believe that? But then we don't realize we're getting hit with the same stuff today. And it's harder to say, oh, that doesn't make sense. Because we're in the middle of it. We can. So it's sometimes fun to look back at history and see what happens. So this is one. This whole idea that there's aliens all over the galaxy. And so, we've been looking really hard for like 50 years, and this is for anything, for any sign at all, and we're not finding anything. And so you wonder, okay, when are the atheists going to start owning up to that or admitting? Because again, it's their idea of evolution and atheism. They would predict that, there's civilizations all over the place. So this was really interesting. This was from Oxford University. This was about 2 years or 3 years ago now. And so it's a little bit verbose, but I just want to read it to you, because what they're basically saying is, they realize that as hard as we've looked, there aren't any other civilizations out there. Okay, so how do you back away from that? For 50 years we've been, making movies about aliens, telling people about aliens, and so how do you back out of that? So they're starting to try to back out of it. So this is Oxford University says, when we take account of realistic uncertainty, replacing point estimates by probability distributions that reflect current scientific understanding, we find no reason to be highly confident that the galaxy or observable universe contains other civilizations, and thus no longer find our observations in conflict with our prior probabilities. That's a long way of saying we were wrong, we're sorry. Okay, okay. So, but that's basically that's basically what they're saying. And then it goes on, and we found qualitatively similar results through two different methods. And then right at the end. So this is a very atheistic group. They're saying when we update this prior in light of the Fermi observation, we find a substantial probability that we are alone in our galaxy and perhaps even in our observable universe. And what they're quoting was the Fermi paradox, where he said, Now, he was the opposite. I mean, he did a lot of things, but he said, where are they? And that was just like, for 3 words, that was a really good question. Because he was like, if there's aliens out there, where are they? Because even then they couldn't find them. And so, but anyway, so that's, again, true science is advanced. Ignorance is the friend of the atheist. Before we had any observations, before we had radio telescopes, we could make up the fact that there's humans on Mars. That's ignorance. Again, not saying that they're not smart, they were ignorant. And then now to the point where we know, they are saying that we're probably alone in our galaxy and possibly in the observable universe. Now, of course, that's very consistent with the Bible, Genesis 1:26-27. Then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. So again, but we all get to choose where we put our faith. Again, going back a few hours, just the fact that we do get to choose where we put our faith tells us where we should put our faith, because only God could give us that ability. We have this other idea related, okay, well, where did the universe come from? And so there was an attempt, back in the 1800s to make the universe infinitely old. Again, just to try to, somehow, if someone wanted to believe in evolution, try to give as long of a time as possible. We showed that time really doesn't matter. But then that kind of developed into these, what you call like billions of years theories. And so this is the idea that maybe the universe is somehow billions of years old. And I think, depending on who you're looking at, some people are saying 13.7 billion years, I think now, but then there's a lot of studies out now saying that's off by a couple billion. I work for the government, so I always put dollars after I say billion. But they say it's after a couple billion years. Okay, so that's the. But anyway, but we knew there was things wrong with those theories. And so in the mid 1970s, all this evidence against the theories, it started to be publicized. Okay, and so so we knew there was something wrong, and so we actually started making things up to try to pretend that our observations supported the Big Bang Theory, or the Big Bang Theory was consistent with our observations. And so the first two that they came up with, it was dark matter and dark energy. And I remember that. I was interested in science. I was younger then. But I still remember there was kind of a little bit of a uproar, because it's like, well, you can't make up 50% of the universe. That's just, you need to get rid of that theory. I mean, how could you have a theory where you have to make up 50% of the universe? And so, but the response was, well, no, we're just doing that for now. We need to make up this 50%, and then as science advances, as we get more data, then that number will come down. And so the theory will work. So we stick with it. Well, so that was at 50%. Well, now we're up to 96%. Okay, so why don't you think about it? So 96% of the universe has to be made up for the Big Bang to work. And so we'll talk a lot on that. But again, it ends up being 73% dark matter, 73% dark energy, 23% dark matter. It's a huge fraction of the universe has to be made up. Now, this was a quote from Mike Griffin, former NASA administrator, really smart guy, really very hardworking. He says, what is the value of discovering that literally 95% of the universe consists of dark energy or dark matter, terms for things that we as yet know nothing about, but they make up 95% of our universe? And so it's funny, I was working late one night, and so I actually emailed him about this. And they said, well, how do we know, if we know nothing about them, how do we know that it makes up 95% of the universe? And so it was probably about midnight, and I'm packing up, getting ready to go home, and I sent on email. I said, okay. And literally by 12:30, he emailed me back. And so again, like I said, he's really hardworking, very, very smart guy. And he just said, well, it has to for the Big Bang to work. Okay, so then they emailed him back. So, well, how do we know the? So we went back and forth. Unfortunately, again, I actually was hoping to try to get him interested in a Bible study, interested in the Bible. It didn't, but it was just kind of interesting, because even when he made that quote, he was, he's an NASA administrator. So he said, well, what's the value of? Well, just like his quote says, what's the value of exploring space? Well, the idea is because we know so little about it. I mean, we know so little about the universe. That's why it's so important to explore the universe. So I agree with him completely on that. But it's just interesting, the reasoning where, okay, if we assume the Big Bang is true, then we have to make all these other assumptions. Otherwise, we're going to have to reject, that the Big Bang is true. So that was, so again, just kind of think of it that way. A lot of what you see because you'll have magazines, they'll publish things like a map of dark matter. I remember seeing that one. And all that really is, that's all, so you think, oh, wow, we've mapped dark matter. Well, wait, by definition, you cannot see dark matter. So all it really was a map of all the places we've had to add a fudge factor to make the Big Bang Theory work. Okay, so just want to, just when you see stuff like that, think carefully. What are they really saying? How is it being phrased? And so this was out of Scientific American. I like that quote at the bottom. It does say, like at the top, it says, it has been noted that names dark matter and dark energy serve mainly as expressions of our ignorance, much as the marking of early maps with terra incognita. Very, that's very accurate. It's a very secular magazine, but very, very good quote. And then at the bottom, it says, dark energy considered even stranger. The only thing we know about dark energy is its name. Okay, and so again, they're just saying, basically admitting we've made this up. And again, it's a very, pro-evolution, magazine. But again, when scientists speak as scientists, it really doesn't matter what, if they've chosen to be an atheist or, if they're speaking as scientists, they can make some good points. And then again, just a lot of quotes. If you go out online, again, talking about, just dark matter, dark energy, and all the ways that it happens to be applied. This was from the University of California Observatories, LIC. But it talks about how you even need, even to make stars. A lot of us, when I was in school, we were told, well, you get this big cloud of gas, and then that gas would collapse on itself and form a star. Well, we know that doesn't work. As the gas starts to collapse, it heats up and it blows itself apart. It'd be like, just think like popping a balloon and having all the air go inward. No, it goes outward, to expand. So that's what we were, and so that's, so what they do is they say, well, there's this little bit of dark matter to make the star form. And so it's applied all over the place. And that's what, in this particular quote, it says, again, just talks about the dark matter, but it's all made up. Rather than admitting that God created the universe, God created the stars, we just make up things, or we are making up things to try to pretend that somehow it could just make itself. So where we're at now, dark matter, dark energy, we can distribute it throughout the universe anywhere, any way we want to. We can give them any property desired. They talk about dark flow, dark light, inflation. You have all these different fudge factors. And so what I want to point out is that a similar approach can be used to support virtually any theory imagined. And so that's the key. This is not a scientific theory. And so it's after lunch, a lot of times after a month. I know you guys do this too. You like to do a math problem just to get the blood pumping and everything. And so just gonna ask a question. If and don't do algebra. Just give me a number. If x plus y is 100, what does x equal? Yeah. Okay. Exactly.
Between 1 and 100.
Yeah, or even negative. You can go negative. Yeah. So yeah, you're right. Yeah, but you're right. So say x is negative 100. You're absolutely right. Y is 200. So x plus y is 100. 99. You're absolutely right. X is 99. Y is 1. Someone says 20. You're absolutely right. X is 20. Y is 80. So in that situation, it doesn't matter what number you give me. I can always say there's a y that makes the answer correct. Say I came back next year and I said, hey, guys, I got some bad news. The answer is really 200. Okay, well, the good news is you're still all right. Because if x was minus 100, you're right. Now y is 300. If x was 99, you're right. Y is 101. If x was 20, y is 180. So in that situation, if we can make up, if we're allowed to make up 96% of the universe, it doesn't matter what the observations are. We can add fudge factors in to pretend any set of observations supports any theory we want. Okay, and that's where we're at right now. So when I talk about the Big Bang Theory, it's not a scientific theory at all, because one of the things about a scientific theory is you have to be able to devise an experiment to prove it's incorrect. And the way the Big Bang is constructed, whenever we find a contradiction, we just add a fudge factor. And so it's been proven incorrect for probably 40 years, but it's the best the atheists can do. And so that's the theory that's used. And it has, we'll talk about it, has some other very strange implications we'll talk about in a minute. But you see how, again, if I have my observations, we're getting more and more observations, and they keep contradicting the Big Bang Theory, but then I have fudge factors, pretty much unlimited fudge factors that we can put in, do anything we want to with. And so, of course, I can say they support this theory. And it doesn't matter what the theory is. And it really doesn't matter what the observations are, because I can make up everything in between. So does everyone kind of see that clear? Okay, so Christians aren't the only ones that have noticed this. And this was really interesting. This was probably 17 years ago now. There was an open letter It was written to new scientists, and this was signed by several hundred astronomers, professors, national laboratory employees, and most of them probably weren't Christians. So even though they would say the Big Bang is wrong, they weren't saying to replace it with something that was biblical. They just said it's wrong. We've got to give up on it. We've got to move on to something else. So this was a quote. It says, "The Big Bang today relies on a growing number of hypothetical entities, things we've never observed. Inflation, dark matter, and dark energy are the most prominent examples. Without them, there would be a fatal contradiction between the observations made by astronomers and the predictions of the Big Bang theory." So that's what we're talking about. You have to have these fudge factors. You have to make things up. Otherwise, you get this fatal contradiction. It goes on, and it says, "In no other field of physics would this continual recourse to new hypothetical objects be accepted as a way of bridging the gap between theory and observation. It would, at the least, raise serious questions about the validity of the underlying theory." So again, these are secular scientists. They're not. But they're dead on. Exactly. What possible field of science of engineering would this be acceptable? Because to make up 96% of the universe, and then again, it just talks about growing number of hypothetical entities that are being invoked. Goes on and says, "What is more, the Big Bang theory can boast of no quantitative predictions that have subsequently been validated by observation. The successes claimed by the theory supporters consist of its ability to retrospectively fit observations." So you make the observation, they're saying you retrospectively fit observations with a steadily increasing array of adjustable parameters. So again, they're just saying if you make an observation, it contradicts the theory, you add a fudge factor. That's kind of the standard approach that's being used. And it says, "Just as the old Earth-centered cosmology of Ptolemy needed layer upon layer of epicycles." Okay, now that last phrase is an insult. When you guys were in first grade, did you ever say that to somebody on the playground? Yeah, probably not. Okay. But the whole point was that what they're saying is Ptolemy had he had an Earth-centered cosmology. So he said all the planets, basically all planets, the sun, everything rotated around the Earth or revolved around the Earth. And we got true science advanced, and we started to have contradictions. You started to say, no, this doesn't look like everything, sun, planets, everything is revolving around the Earth. And so, but rather than saying, rather than his supporters saying you're right, we were wrong, the planets, the sun, everything doesn't revolve around the Earth, he started adding what he called epicycles. So an observation would come in that contradicted his idea, and he would just add, or his supporters would just add another fudge factor. And so what these, again, hundreds of astronomers, national lab employees, professors signing this petition, what they're saying is, we're doing the same thing with the Big Bang. We get an observation comes in that contradicts the Big Bang, we just add the equivalent of an epicycle, just like Ptolemy did. So that's, so again, very, very powerful. But again, that's kind of where so if someone says they're putting their faith in the Big Bang Theory, and I'm not sure, that's the one, it just really depends on the person and how you're talking to them, but maybe that's, just an angle you could take. You just say, well, right now we're having to make up 96% of the universe, and so it's, we know, even secular scientists know it's wrong, and just try to work them down that, just try to, I don't want to say shake their faith in the Big Bang Theory, but at least let them know what they're putting their faith in, and again, it's not really even a scientific theory. Now this was interesting because, we talked about how this commitment to atheism, commitment to, evolution or atheism, the commitment to this idea that the universe and everything in it just made itself, pointed out that that's really hurting us, not just spiritually, but also physically. And so these were two papers that came out. This was from the Proceedings of the National Academies of Science. This is about 12 years ago. It says, mathematicians have come up with an answer Monday for the mystery of dark energy tearing the universe apart at an accelerating rate. It says it ain't there, but, and it goes on. But right at the end there, so they talk about how they have this idea, mathematicians do, but when it comes down to it, it says the only problem is that for the equations to work, we must be literally at the center of the universe. Says physicist Lawrence Krauss of Arizona University. It doesn't seem physically relevant. Okay, so the Bible doesn't tell us where God put Earth, but as a Christian, he could have put the Earth anywhere he wanted to, and to me it's not unreasonable that he could put us near the center of the universe. And so now all of a sudden you have a team of mathematicians, these are non-Christians, and they say, we've got this idea, we can get rid of dark energy. Okay, so just think about that. 73% of the universe right now has to be dark energy. It's completely made up. It's a fudge factor. They said, hey, we've got an idea that can get rid of the need for dark energy. That's something you win a Nobel Prize for. I mean, you really, when you step back and think about it, here's our cosmology. 96% of the universe is made up. Well, hey, 73% of that they can get rid of, but we have to be at the center of the universe. And then it says, so it doesn't seem physically relevant. Well, why wouldn't it seem physically relevant? To me, that's a huge technical, scientific clue that, hey, we're near the center of the universe. Because I get rid of 73% fudge factor. But it's not physical. Well, the reason is, I'll go on, because it's fun. At the same time, a team of physicists roughly the same time, a team of physicists came up with the same idea. This was in Physical Review Letters. And they said, well, it violates the Copernican principle. Okay, so remember we had directed panspermia this morning. Technical name must be correct. Well, the Copernican principle, again, its technical sounding name must be, well, it's got nothing to do with science. It's just this idea where the atheists will say, well, we can't be any place special. So in other words, we cannot be anywhere special in the universe. And it really drives their whole idea of the Big Bang, really drives their whole cosmology. You have all this evidence that we're near the center. You get rid of dark energy, again, get rid of the 73% fudge factor. But they said the same thing. If the Earth and its environs are centered at a vast billion light year, they have all these reasons. They say that we don't need dark energy. But then at the bottom it says, but that scenario violates the Copernican principle, a notion near and dear to the hearts of physicists and cosmologists, including Caldwell and Stebbins. Well, wait a second, that's not science. I mean, it might be their religion, but it's not science. And so you wonder just how much our commitment to society's commitment to denying God, just how much that is setting science back. And so those are two examples. But you see just how powerful that is? And because you step back and you say, wow, we have no idea about the universe. We've got this theory, but we have to make up 96% of the universe and some other factors. These people come in, they say, hey, I can get rid of a huge chunk of that fudge factor. And they just, it can't be relevant because it doesn't support atheism. So again, it's really, really holding us back. It's not just doing damage spiritually, it's also physical. Just want to emphasize that. So there are biblically consistent answers. One question is, well, then how can you see light from stars that are millions of light years away? If the Earth was located near the center of the universe, then straightforward reading of the Bible in Creation Week, you can actually have, during Creation Week, you actually have the Earth inside what they would call a timeless zone, and then just lots of processes outside of that timeless zone. And so again, it becomes fully consistent with the universe looking exactly the way it does from an Earth that's on the order of 6,000 years old. And so, but again, it would, in that case, we'd be using gravitational time dilation. And that's one we won't get into much today, but like here, we're deeper in a gravity well than, say, at the top of Mount Everest. So time is actually passing more slowly here than it is at the top of Mount Everest. And so that particular idea is biblically consistent, and it's also right at the edge of our understanding of physics. But Einstein predicted it. We have experiments verifying it. And so, but that's just one possible idea. But that would be, again, completely rejected, even though it does a much better job predicting what we see from the Earth. It would be rejected, well, two reasons. We have to be in a special location, and it would give very strong support for the Earth being on the order of 6,000 to 7,000 years old. And so that's, there are some excellent books and materials available on that. And those would be, again, available at that website. Now, the Bible talks about stretching out the heavens, Isaiah 40:22, Job 9:8. I think it's about 17 times total. So we have no idea. We talk about maybe there's like a fabric of space or, space as it's. Well, if that gets stretched, that's beyond our current understanding of physics. And so what effects would that have as far as, again, how the universe appears? But again, that's something we should be investigating. Because going back to the quote from Mike Griffin, we know so little about the universe. We need to be able to investigate it just with an open mind, with true science, and not be constrained to not look at something that will confirm the Bible. We know that true science always confirms the Bible. As science advances, it will confirm the Bible. So that's where the answer will lie. But we're not allowed to, we're discouraged from looking at that right now. What if God chose to make parts of creation mature, accelerated processes during creation? Again, that's one just again, we know, Adam and Eve were created as adults and things like that, and then affected new discoveries. Had a question down here or comment?
Thank you. If I look at Isaiah 40:22 and Job 9:8, are these some of the verses that Christian flat earthers are using to kind of justify the notion that the earth is flat?
I'm not sure. I think I was referring to, they talk about how God stretches out the heavens, and that would be stretching out, basically the fabric of space, and then what effect that would have on just again how the universe appears from an Earth that's a few thousand years old. So I'm not too familiar with that idea.
Can I have a follow-up question?
Sure. Oh yeah.
Thank you. In your experience, in what you've seen at NASA, did you at any time had a visual of from Earth to somewhere out space that there are disks flying around, or are they all like a little ball? These are important questions for us in the church as leadership, because you've got members coming literally and they read the Bible like crazy.
Okay.
I've got maybe Brother Malan to kind of back me up here. Give me a nod, my brother. Yeah, I got a nod. Okay, it's called coercion.
Yeah, all right.
And we need to somehow have a way of understanding. One day when we have enough money, we must probably fly high enough to see ourselves back at Earth to see. But I don't have that kind of resources right now.
Right.
So I will use your eyes.
Yeah. So it's there's many how to phrase it, topics that sometimes Christians and very well-meaning Christians we may start to disagree on. And so one of the things I'm careful is want to just to make sure people are aware that the Bible is God's inerrant word, and that we are to go into all the world and preach the gospel, and that we need to preach the plan of salvation. And so I'm like everyone else. I have a lot of opinions on a lot of things, but I really try to just keep it focused on, because I think I know what you're saying, but I don't want to, that would be a different discussion, and be happy to have that discussion with anyone. And it is important, for maintaining church unity, but one of the things I think we can all focus on is that the Bible is God's inerrant word. The Bible, we need to be focused on eternity, focused on the spiritual, and encouraging people to obey the gospel. So it's many important topics like that, but it's sometimes in those discussions it almost becomes like an impasse. I'll use the example in the United States. It's people say, well, how many angels can fit on the head of a pin? Okay, and it's amazing how many hours people can talk about debating how many angels can fit, and it's good, but it needs to be done in a way that builds unity and fellowship, and so there's a lot of analogous topics that if we're not careful they can become divisive, and so it's just when we're talking to somebody, just try to keep us all unified, and the Bible's God's inerrant word, and here's what the Bible says. So that's.
Okay. Normally, I would go from there to Colossians chapter 2,
okay.
21, handle not, taste not. And I'm trying to figure out at what point does it become a salvation matter or not.
Right.
And that was the reason why I wanted to raise this. Because sometimes with some of the brethren that we're dealing with, we're going down the path of having to counsel with them because it becomes a salvation matter for them.
Right. Yeah, and then that's that's very important, if it's, if it's causing them to, question their faith, or then that becomes very important. So you're absolutely right. That's and it's on a very individual basis. It's not one that there's a real. It just depends on what the person might be struggling with or what they're. But yeah, it's. But for some people, like the angels on the head of a pin, you can usually say, well, that was fun. We'll order one more pizza, and as soon as we're done eating that one, then we'll move on. It's not a. But other people, it can become become more of an issue. So it's a good point. Excellent point. So, but these verses, this was just in the context. There's so much we don't know about the universe. Made a way to think about it is just Christians shouldn't let this affect their faith. Because if someone straightforward reading of the Bible, or on the order of 6,000 years old, and we'll talk more about during the radiometric dating section, but that is an area where the atheists try to attack, because there is, again, ignorance is the friend of the atheist. And so there's so little, we know so little about the universe that they play on that. It's just like when the Wall Street Journal, and I'm not blaming the Wall Street Journal, they were just told that, hey, we have proof that there's people walking around on Mars. Well, that was ignorance. That's the friend of the atheist. And then as science advanced, we said, no, there's no people on Mars. There's not even a bacteria on Mars. And so it's, but right now, that's kind of where we're at with the universe. And so the atheists will use that as a way to try to lead people from the church. They'll say, oh, no, we know the Big Bang. And it's like, and we already know the Big Bang's wrong, but it's amazing how much it's taught, how many people think that it's actual science. So, yeah.
When you were talking about the Big Bang, do you not believe then that the scientists that work on radio telescopes that are getting the radiation back from the Big Bang, do you not believe in what they are saying?
Well, they're getting definitely radiation. That's one thing I should mention. It's just like radiometric dating. The measurements themselves are completely accurate. But it's just how those measurements, well, they're very accurate. But it's just how those measurements, how those readings are interpreted, that's inaccurate. And so you're right, they will get readings back, and it'll be either reported very objectively, but usually what makes the more public press is they get these, is they'll try to say that, oh, this somehow confirms the Big Bang. And so like the cosmic background radiation, there's many things about that profile. It's too smooth, okay? And so because it's so smooth, we created a fudge factor. We called it inflation. Okay, and so I believe completely their measurements, they're good scientists, they're getting good data, but that was a classic case of this data comes back, it doesn't match the Big Bang, and so we made up, in that case it was inflation. We have no idea what would have started inflation, no idea what would have stopped inflation, but we just, to make that observation, that particular data, somehow not destroy the Big Bang theory, we made up another fudge factor. So excellent question though. Okay, great. Okay, now this is one just, again, what's really interesting is you can go out on the internet and there's some sites and they'll say that, oh, we know the age of the universe to 5 significant digits. And I think one site says it's like 13.781 billion years. But then you start reading in the technical literature and they'll say, we have no idea what the age of the universe is. This was from the AP about 2 years ago. It says the universe is looking younger every day, it seems. New calculations suggest the universe could be a couple billion years younger than scientists now estimate, and even younger than suggested by 2 other calculations published this year that trimmed hundreds of millions of years from the age of the cosmos. The huge swing in scientists' estimates, even this new calculation could be off by billions of years, reflect different approaches to the tricky problem of figuring the universe's really age. So again, this is just the idea. You go to one site and they'll say, well, yeah, we know the Bible's wrong because we know the age of the universe to, what they call 5 significant digits. And then you go to another site, and these are all non-Christians, and they'll say, oh, yeah, we're probably off by billions of years because we have these other ways of calculating the age. So again, the Earth, just straightforward reading the Bible, a few thousand years old. But it's just interesting, depending on, again, who we're talking to, they'll either say, oh, no, we know the age of the universe just down to this much. But then the same non-Christian secular scientists will say, no, we're off by billions of years. So it's just another interesting, again, just an approach if someone says, okay, somehow the Big Bang has proved, the universe is really old or something. Even the secular, non-Christian scientists disagree amongst themselves. Then, of course, we talked briefly this morning, obvious questions, what was there before the alleged Big Bang? This is also key. It's always an appeal to the supernatural. And so popular ones today, you have, one is saying, okay, there's a multiverse generator that's just generating all of these universes, but it's outside the observable universe. It's outside of nature, so it's an appeal to the supernatural. Another one that was popular a few years ago was, the Big Bang, it started as a point of infinite density where the laws of nature don't apply. Again, an appeal to the supernatural. So, the Bible addresses this in the very first verse, with God being outside of time and God creating the universe. But all of these atheistic theories, at some point, they always appeal to the supernatural. So that's maybe another point that could be mentioned to people. But then finally, and this was a great question earlier today, this was this idea of Boltzmann brains. It's kind of another way of thinking that we're just imagining all this, or this isn't real. So this is a quote, and I think this is pretty sure this was from Wikipedia, but I just went out on the internet, got a quote. And this was what they call the Boltzmann brain problem. And they're actually people getting funding to study this because it's a little bit analogous to the free will. like if God hadn't given us a soul, we couldn't make even the simplest choice. Well, this one's pretty analogous because people are going to look at this and they're going to say, that's ridiculous. Just like if someone says, like, I couldn't, choose to, pick up my foot just now or do something like that, I'd say, oh, that's ridiculous. I know I could make that choice. So they don't like to talk about this one either because people will look at this and say, well, there's no way, that's absurd. The quote was, if our current level of organization, having many self-aware entities, is a result of a random fluctuation. And so what that's basically saying, if the universe, universe has a lot of people in it, and if that was a result of a random fluctuation, it's much less likely than a level of organization which only creates standalone self-aware entities. And so that's basically saying, if our universe was a result of what they called a random fluctuation, well, that's much less likely than just all these little brains popping up. And those are the Boltzmann brains. So it goes on and says, for every universe with the level of organization we see, there should be an enormous number of lone Boltzmann brains floating around in unorganized environments. Okay, so that's ego from Guardians of the Galaxy. Looking for the reference on that. Okay. And then it says, in an infinite universe, the number of self-aware brains that spontaneously and randomly form out of the chaos, complete with memories of a life like ours, should vastly outnumber the brains evolved from an inconceivably rare local fluctuation the size of the observable universe. So basically what they're saying is it's not just that there is a chance that you're just a brain that's popped into existence and you think you had a childhood and you think it's almost like 100% chance that's what you are. Okay, so that's one of those ones where they call it the Boltzmann brain problem because it's just absurd, and so they know people won't accept that, and so they don't like to talk about it. But that is what they call the Boltzmann brain problem. And it's just like it's absurd to say we don't have free will. We have no idea how God gives us free will, but everybody knows they can make choices. Everybody knows they have free will. Likewise, most people are going to find it really absurd to think that they're imagining everything. But that's again where this. Genesis 7:19 through 23, and the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered, and all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle and beasts, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man, all in whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life, and all that was on the dry land died. So he destroyed all living things which were on the face of the ground, both man and cattle, creeping thing and bird of the air. They were destroyed from the earth. Only Noah and those who were with him in the ark remained alive. So again, so flood's devastating beyond comprehension. And so we start saying, okay, what evidence do we have for the flood? Well, this one, we'll get into a lot of the physical evidence, but this one to me is really fascinating. So you think of, biblically what happens is you have the flood, and then people come out of the ark and they, begin to multiply. And then, but then they rather than filling the earth, they all, stay together and they start building the Tower of Babel, of course, which was against what God had told them to do. And so they get scattered at the Tower of Babel. And there's different families went to different parts of the world. And then as far as we know, just centuries and centuries, there was no contact between the different civilizations that were established. And that's a fascinating study in itself, just how many of the ancient civilizations, when they first arose, they were at their peak. I mean, you look at even the Egyptians, the Great Pyramid, first pyramid built was the best one, the most precise one. So totally consistent with the Bible, because that's what you'd expect biblically. But so they're all scattered. Well, then all of a sudden everybody starts talking with each other again. We figure out that all these different cultures talk about a flood. And so to me, that's just fascinating, because how else would that happen? I mean, biblically, it makes sense. I mean, they all knew about the flood. They're all descendants of, Noah and Noah's 3 sons and their wives. They all know about the flood, and then they scatter. But in their legends, they knew about a flood. And so now today we realize that, hey, all these civilizations, all these cultures that never, to our knowledge, had never talked to each other, well, they all talk about a flood. So it's just kind of one of those get you thinking type of things. It's not necessarily going to prove anything to anybody, but it's so consistent with the Bible and so hard to explain any other way. In other words, it's hard to explain. You can't say that, they all made up this legend and for some reason they were all really similar. There were a lot of similarities between them. So, excuse me. So anyway, to me, that's just an observation. Now, what we do see geologically, okay, so the flood was extremely catastrophic. There were extensive geological changes, activities, and then the post-flood world was very different from the pre-flood world. And so what I mean by that is, sometimes people say, well, where was the Garden of Eden? There's no point on earth that fits the description of the Garden of Eden. Well, the Garden of Eden physically was destroyed during the flood. And that's how extensive the geologic changes were. So you wouldn't expect. Now, after the flood, we named, it's just like when people settle a new land, like when the United States was settled, they'd use some of the names from where they used to live. And so after the flood, you'd have some of the names, the Tigris, Euphrates, you have some of the names mentioned, but totally different geology. One of the events that really got people thinking was actually Mount St. Helens. It was a volcano that erupted in the United States. I think it was back in 1980. And we started seeing things like strata being laid down very rapidly. We started seeing canyons being carved very rapidly. So all these processes that many people had thought would take millions of years to occur, we could see happening in hours or days. And so people started to think, okay, maybe evidence, again, very consistent with the flood. Then this was on the lower right. That's pictured of the channeled scablands. That was a kind of a medium-sized flood that was believed to occur after the Ice Age. But again, just shows how much how much erosion, how canyons can form, how things are formed in a flood. What's interesting about that one is the individual who first proposed that was caused by a flood. He was kind of ridiculed for decades because he just said flood. And as soon as he said, well, maybe it was a flood caused by like an ice dam at the end of the Ice Age breaking and just releasing huge amounts of water. Well, then all of a sudden he wins like one of the highest awards ever. I think it was the National Geological Society, like the Penrose Medal, because again he'd removed the Bible from it. And so again, just interesting. But now absolutely everybody says, oh yeah, obviously that was caused by a flood. But until it was clear they weren't talking about Noah's flood, they weren't going to even think about it. So just again, kind of interesting. Now, do you have evidence of a massive worldwide die-off of marine life, which is very consistent with Genesis 7:11. All the fountains of the great deep were broken up and the windows of heaven were open. We see osmium and shale oil, very consistent with volcanic activity, and then evidence of immersion of all land. Again, Genesis 7:19-20, all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. And a lot of evidence for that, but also just the fact that we see marine fossils on mountaintops. So, some of the evidences that are consistent with a global flood, you see what you call fossil graveyards. And this is, for an example, you can go in the United States just hundreds of miles where you don't see a fossil. And then all of a sudden you'll get in an area where there's just fossils everywhere. So I was blessed to go with my son out to the state of Wyoming. And there's an area in Wyoming where you literally go there and you're digging for dinosaur fossils. And you'd say, well, where should you dig? And they say, well, anywhere. And sure enough, you just dig a little bit and you find dinosaur fossils. Okay, and so, but when you think about that, okay, if a river floods, I know you have some rivers. Well, if you have a heavy rain and a river floods, do you ever notice that like all the debris will pile up in certain locations? And so after the flood recedes, it's just pretty clear, but then all of a sudden there's big piles of debris. Well, that's just because of the currents of the water and how, just how the water's flowing, how the debris is being moved. And so that's what you see in a flood is lots of debris all piled together. Well, that's exactly what we see in the fossil record. You'll go for just, literally hundreds of miles with no fossils and then just all of them together. So it's very consistent with a global flood, these fossil graveyards. And so there's some of the more famous fossil graveyards. You have folded rock layers with no fractures. Now this one, you can, in the Grand Canyon out in the United States, you'll see these strata. It's the same strata, but it'll be like going like this, and then literally sometimes it'll make an S curve. And that could be like 100 feet. And then the same strata comes out the bottom. Well, you start thinking, well, how could that form slowly? How could that be like at the bottom of some ocean and then slowly be building up? Because that would be flat. So you don't see that. And then they say, well, maybe it formed and then it was uplifted. Well, the rock is, if it did that, the rock would crack. If you ever take like a coffee cup after it's been fired, you can't, once it's pottery, you can't just shape it. You can shape it when it's soft. You can take clay, the potter can make the clay look any shape it wants. Once that's been fired, you can't just bend it because it's brittle. Well, same thing with that rock. That rock, you can take it between your fingers and rub it together. It just crumbles, totally brittle. You look at those S curves, there's not a crack. So these folded rock layers, I might have a picture in here. Yeah, that's a picture of a folded rock layer in the left-hand corner. And it's just the, again, it's just this perfect fold. You look at how fossils are, how perfect they're formed. When an animal dies, there's a video I saw of an elephant dying, of a dead elephant carcass, an elephant carcass one. And it was a time-lapse photography. Literally within 2 months, you couldn't have even told there was an elephant there, just between the scavengers and the bacteria and everything, just eating that carcass. So for a fossil to form, it has to be formed very quickly, because look, like on the bottom left there, like trilobites, where you can see, you can even see the compound lens system in the eye. So you know that fossil had to form very quickly. Again, very consistent with the global flood. Now you get more subtle in the upper right there. This is the Coconino sandstone. Again, that's in the United States. It's you can kind of see angles. They call that cross bedding. Well, that's consistent with rock that was formed underwater. It's basically like dunes that are formed underwater. They have a certain angle that's different than sand dunes. The angle of that cross bedding, it's in the range of what you would see underwater, completely out of the range of what would be formed in air. Okay, now that one, you're like, well, I'll probably never use that one, and that's probably true. But the point is, again, true science is a Christian's friend. The more we get into the detail, the more it confirms the Bible. So literally, even down to the angle of the cross bedding in strata we see confirms the Bible. In this case, it's confirming the flood and refutes the atheistic ideas. And so again, just kind of want to keep emphasizing that. And then we see a lot of evidence of sand, things that have been transported for many miles, like thousands of kilometers to where they're deposited. Again, consistent with the global flood, very hard to explain anywhere else. Another area that people discuss related to the flood is the geologic, the fossil record, I think is a really key one, because you look at, there's really two ways to explain, or two general ways people explain the fossil record. One is you say, okay, at the bottom of the fossil record, these are animals that supposedly evolved a really long time ago, first, and then above that, the animals that evolved next and next and next and next and next. So that's kind of the standard atheistic explanation. But a better explanation, based on all the evidence, is that the fossil record shows the order in which animals were buried during the flood. And so you look at like the fountains of the great deep. Well, you would expect that the marine animals would be buried first, and that's what we see. And then above that, it's just as the habitats are getting destroyed, that's the order that things are being buried in the flood. Now you have other things. Some animals could flee rising floodwaters faster than others. Some animals float. Mammals tend to float when they drown. I know this gets kind of morbid, but mammals tend to float when they drown. Reptiles tend to sink. You have a lot of those factors coming in, but it explains also the lack of transitional forms. We don't see transitions between one kind of animal and another. When an animal shows up in the fossil record, it's typically fully formed, fully functional, and it doesn't change. You'll see, sometimes you'll be watching a special on TV, and it'll be a secular special, be completely non-Christian. They'll say things like, well, boy, sharks, I don't know if you've ever heard this. Have you ever heard that sharks have remained unchanged for 400 million years? Okay, so that's a popular one. Well, step back and think what they're saying. Okay, what they're really saying is, throughout the entire fossil record, sharks are the same. And so as Christians, we don't believe the 400 million years, but we do believe you'd expect, they were just sharks that were buried during the flood. And so it's very biblically consistent. You have to take out the 400 million years, and you think about, well, does that make any sense from an evolutionary standpoint? You have basically nothing. All of a sudden, sharks show up, fully functional. They remain essentially unchanged throughout the whole fossil record. And that, so again, makes perfect sense from a biblical standpoint. Doesn't make sense from an evolution standpoint. So how these fossils are interpreted, again, it's all subject to interpretation. It's like a really good question in back. I believe the data completely. Someone says they found a fossil. This is what it looked like. Here's what the bones are. Here was the location. I think they're doing those measurements right. It's just how that's interpreted is the key difference. And so again, so the lack of transitional forms, of course, that's because they never existed. Whereas again, evolutionists, a lot of times they'll have to talk about, they'll kind of make things up. One, they tried to punctuate equilibrium, things are the same, and all of a sudden they change really fast. A lot of ideas, but they really have a trouble explaining the lack of transitional forms. And so when we talk about transitional forms, it's really important because when we find a fossil, there's two ways that typically different fossils can be interpreted if they look kind of the same. And one is, it's okay, maybe this is a transitional form of one type of animal or one kind of animal turning into another kind of animal, or it can be variation within a kind. And so when we see this, it's it's always been variation within a kind. Now, for a while, people will talk about maybe they found a transitional form, but again, as true science advances, you find, no, that fossil either fits here within this kind of animal, or say here within this kind of animal. And I'll give kind of just a simple example, but say dogs didn't exist today, and the only evidence we had for dogs was in the fossil record. And we found a Yorkie and a Beagle and a German Shepherd. Okay, well, there's two ways that could be interpreted. You could say they're all dogs, variation within kind, which of course is the right answer. But if you really think about it, there is a lot of difference between a Yorkie and a Beagle and a German Shepherd. And someone that was trying to support another theory, the idea of evolution, could say, well, no, we see evidence of Yorkies that they evolved into Beagles, that they evolved into German Shepherds. So it's the same data, and this is really important, same data, same measurements, but completely different interpretations. This is a quote from David Pilbeam. He was a paleoanthropologist at Yale University. He said, I'm also aware of the fact that at least in my own subject of paleoanthropology, theory heavily influenced by implicit ideas almost always dominates data. Ideas that are totally unrelated to actual fossils have dominated theory building, which in turn strongly influence the way fossils are interpreted. And so really what he's saying there is, again, we have this idea that one kind of animal turns into another kind of animal. We talked about this morning how that's impossible. We know from genetics. But we have this idea, and so when fossils are found, they try to still fit it into this idea of showing one kind of animal turning into another kind of animal. This was a quote from Dr. Colin Patterson. He was senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History. He says, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. You suggest that an artist should be used to visualize such transformations, but where would he get the information from? I could not honestly provide it, and if I were to leave it to an artistic license, would that not mislead the reader? So what he's saying is, he wrote a book, and it's probably a book on anthropology or evolution, and but he didn't have any transitional forms in his book. And so the publisher said, hey, make the book a lot better if you include some transitional forms. He said he didn't know of any. And he wasn't going to make them up. Now, unfortunately, that is changing. In a lot of our textbooks now, they'll have here's what we found, and here's what we found. So that's the actual data. But then in between, they will actually use an artist to say, here's how this turned into that. And the good news right now, at least, is usually in the footnotes, it'll say, this was real, and this was real, and everything in between was, just kind of to illustrate. But I'm wondering what will happen in 10 years, 20 years, if they'll just leave out the footnote. In other words, if they'll just show the pictures and not mention that this is where we actually just have the data. And so that's, that kind of, again, to me, that could also maybe fall into the category of fake science. It just really depends. It's hard to sometimes tell if someone's being, intentionally or unintentionally deceptive. Either way, it's very deceptive. But yes, you had a question? Yeah.
I once asked a friend of my son who was working with one of her. I was once asking a friend of my son. She was working with a professor in Stellenbosch, and they made this evolutionary tree.
Okay.
And I asked her, how much information do you have of the branches that lead up to these animals? And she said, not much.
Yeah.
It's mostly our own imagination.
Yep. No, that's absolutely right. Yeah. Yeah. That was a good, honest response. Yeah. So yeah, no, you're right. And so this is, and so you can see again just this huge pressure, just to use our imaginations to create things, to make things up. This was, so I'm going to give a few examples, and these are just examples of just huge claims that were made saying, oh, okay, we found a missing link or we've proven evolution. That some of them lasted for quite a while. Some of them didn't last long at all. This one, it didn't last too long. This was a cover story in National Geographic. It's very pro-evolution magazine, and apparently a similar cover story had been published in Nature, also very pro-evolution magazine. And it was supposed proof of dinosaur to bird evolution. And so it was displayed in the National Geographic Explorer halls as fossil from October 15th, 1999 until January 21 of 2000. 110,000 people viewed it, mostly children, called The Missing Link. Its article in November 1999 was cover story, Feathers for T-Rex. But in January, it was admitted to be a fraud. And what happened was the people, again, when doing science, had to be very careful just to ask people for data, not to ask them to support a given conclusion. Well, they'd apparently asked people to offered a large sum of money if someone provided proof or evidence that dinosaurs turned into birds. And so they had this fossil, but it was just a body and head of a bird that was combined with the tail of a dinosaur. And so, so you think about that, okay, well, that only lasted for, a few months, but 110,000 people. So can you imagine if you're on your field trip as an elementary student? This was, some of you mentioned you'd been to some of the museums in Washington, D.C. Well, say you went through one of these museums as a child and you saw this and you thought, boy, I've seen with my own eyes now that dinosaurs turned into birds. Then 2 months later, it's admitted that it was a fraud. Well, that's in some obscure part of a magazine, so you never hear about that. So to this day, there's probably 110,000, well, a large fraction of that 110,000 people probably still think that they saw evidence that a dinosaur turned into birds. It's a complete fraud. Now, a lot of times, these frauds, they make a headline, and then they're never really refuted at all. You have to really dig to see them refuted. This one, fortunately, was refuted. It's almost from the start. This is a quote from Storrs Olson. He was the curator of birds at the National Museum of Natural History. Said the idea of feathered dinosaurs and the theropod origin of birds is being actively promulgated by a cadre of zealous scientists acting in concert with certain editors at Nature and National Geographic, who themselves have become outspoken and highly biased proselytizers of the faith. And so it goes on, it says, truth and careful scientific weighing of evidence have been among the first casualties in their program, which is now fast becoming one of the grander scientific hoaxes of our age. So, and again, I don't know if he was a Christian or not, but he was very direct. You appreciate his honesty as a scientist. And so that, some people saw that quote, but then it got, I guess you'd say, even more publicity. This was a front page of USA Today. It's a popular publication in the U.S. And again, they're very, typically very pro-evolution, but said the missing link that wasn't, and it says a bird fossil is hailed as a major find until red-faced scientists discovered it was doctored, and again, kind of goes through the same thing. But it's just an idea. You go from, it's kind of like, humans on Mars to we can't even find a bacteria on Mars to, hey, we've got proof that dinosaurs turned into birds to, that was just a, now, the other one, again, just want to, true science, we can go back and you can just think about, okay, what would it actually take to turn a dinosaur into a bird? Well, there's many, many, many changes, but even if we just looked at, okay, how do you turn a scale into a feather? And that's true science. We can go in a lab, we can study that. Well, we find out, scales are folds of skin, feathers are complex structures of the barbed and hooks. Feathers originate from follicles inside the skin, totally different than scales. Significant new and different genetic information required for a feather. There's no source for that information. Again, we know that from genetics, but it's really even hard to postulate even potential transitional forms, for an animal developing feathers from a scale, and then even the feathered proteins are biochemically different than scale proteins. So there's no reason to go to this vagueness, this idea of the fossils, and somehow the fossils, because again, ignorance is the friend of the atheist, and they're gonna try to just keep things as fuzzy as possible. So they have like pieces of bone or little bits of bone that they can somehow say, well, maybe this shows this. We don't need to do that. In many cases, just from true science that we can do today, we know what the answer is. And of course, the answer is that dinosaurs couldn't turn into birds. Now this is a famous one. This was Nebraska Man. This lasted from about 1922 to 1927. And so you start thinking, well, why are we talking about that now? That was 100 years ago. Well, it actually was at a very influential time in the history of the United States, because we were deciding whether we should allow the idea that apes turned into humans to be taught in our schools. And boy, things have sure changed. Now you're not allowed to teach that apes didn't turn into humans. But then it was, could you teach that apes turned into humans? So this was some of the evidence that was available at that time. And what had happened is they found a tooth out in Nebraska. Okay, and so this tooth, they sent it off to the American Museum of Natural History. Dr. Henry F. Osborne said it's human. Okay, so you find this tooth. Well, from this tooth, we created this whole idea of, it was one of the things we really used to publicize cavemen, and this whole idea of, because you see, again, this is literally a tooth. I don't know if you can see in the upper right of the screen there. So you see Nebraska Man? He's kind of the one standing up. Okay, from a tooth. So we know what Nebraska Man looked like. Then you look at what's in his left hand. Okay, we know what kind of weapons he used, right? He has a club. Just from the tooth. Even more amazing is we know what his wife looked like, okay? Because you see her, she's kind of, just to his right a little bit, kind of. And we know what kind of livestock he kept. If you look in the upper right, you see the camel. So that's from the tooth, okay? And that's, again, just ignorance. It's just this, Imagination, I think, was the word used. Yeah, just this imagination that goes in. Well, of course, a lot of people get fired up. Oh, wow. This whole new, strange world of cavemen that we never knew about. And but then the problem was in 1927, they found another tooth, but this time they found bones with the tooth. Okay, so again, true science, more evidence, Christian's friend. They find bones with the tooth, and they find out that Nebraska man was just an extinct wild pig. I mean, literally, he was just a pig. Because they found the tooth, but then they found the rest of the animal. And so he wasn't even a human. But, 5 years, just really, caught people's imagination, made people talk. So, unfortunately, this is still going on today, this whole idea that apes turned into humans. This was, I don't know if you've ever heard of Lucy or Australopithecines, but that's a popular one today. So this was an article, it was probably from maybe 10 years ago, and this was David Minton. He was an associate professor of anatomy and neurobiology at Washington University. So it's one of the more prestigious medical schools in the United States. I think they're actually ranked like number 2, so they're really, really high up there. And he's pointing out that what he and others were doing is they noticed in these museums and zoos and exhibits, they were talking about Lucy, again trying to push this idea that apes turned into humans. But what they basically do is they take like a mannequin out of say a children's clothing store, and then they would just put a bunch of hair on the mannequin and stick an ape's head on it and say, this is Lucy. And it's absolutely nothing to do with what the fossils look like. And so what they were picking on, or what he was pointing out, was the hands and the feet. And he says, creatures in the species had hands and feet which were not at all like human hands and feet. Rather, they have long curved fingers and toes, even more so than apes today that live mostly in trees. And so, but his point was, there's a lot of artistic license that goes, like we were talking about in the books, but also in these fossils that are reconstructed and how they make the fossil look. And what he's pointing out is there's one thing, it's artistic license, but another one just to be completely wrong, to completely misrepresent the fossils. He's saying in this case, it's being completely misrepresented. And then, it talks about, again, this is just another, artist's rendition of Lucy. It says, Canadian schoolteacher David Buckner has weighed in on the debate by posting an internet challenge to this misleading statue. He says that if people visiting this exhibition were to see an accurate replica of Lucy in the trees with features typical of tree-dwelling primates, it would make them question the whole notion of human evolution. Lucy would be seen as just some sort of extinct ape. But then this is really interesting. The article goes on, it says, Bruce Carr, the zoo's director of education, has no plans to alter the exhibit. We cannot be updating every exhibit based on every new piece of evidence. So that right there, well, it wasn't really new necessarily. But then this is the one that's disturbing. Right then he says, what we look at is the overall exhibit and the impression it creates. We think that the overall impression this exhibit creates is correct. And so just think about what's being said here. So can you imagine you go into a museum or a zoo or someplace and you think you're just going to see, actual things, right? I mean, that's the whole, to me, that's the whole point of a museum. And the exhibit isn't things that are real, but it just creates the impression that person wants you to get. So say that person wants to convince you that evolution is true. Say that person wants to convince you that apes turned into humans, and they feel that they have the license to make that to make that impression. In other words, to just alter their exhibit. That's scary because a child goes in there and sees that. All they're going to remember is, wow, I was in this exhibit and it just showed apes turning into humans. So this is what reasonable. I guess just a reasonable representation of Lucy would look like, or an Australopithecine in the upper right there. That is a really neat looking ape. But it's not going to make someone believe that apes turned into humans, and so that's not the typical representation. So, yeah, got a question?
Have you been to the Ark Encounter in Kentucky?
Yes, yes.
And they have some imaginary animals.
Okay.
And Noah and the things that they would have done. What did you think of that?
So I think reading the signs that went along with it, they would say that a lot of that was based on what level of study they could about, say, the original created kinds. And so a lot of times what they would do is they would say, okay, say you had the original, cat kind or dog kind. They would look at, okay, what what those kinds may have looked like. And so that's where I think because of the way they explained what they had done, to me it made sense, that and then they would have the data, showing that just So I think they definitely did, when they had the imaginary animals, I think they had enough of an explanation with them. And they weren't just saying that this would be like, say you did have a cat with all the genetic information for, that kind, or the dogs. So to me, it would seem very reasonable. Good, thank you. Good point, though. And then, anyway, so just some more quotes. But it's just interesting, the debates at that level. Like, we know this isn't accurate, but we're not going to change it. Usually if someone knows something isn't accurate, especially in that position, they'll want to change it as quickly as possible. So it's just an interesting observation. Now, so these pictures, I took these probably just a couple years ago at our up at Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., at our Natural History Museum. And so it's interesting. So it's kind of like some of the other things we see as true science advances. Like when they started backing off on this idea that there's civilizations all over the galaxy, or backing off on this idea or that idea, starting to do the same with Lucy, but it's still there. In this case, it says the brown bones are cast the parts of Lucy's skeleton that were excavated. The black bones represent missing parts. So there's a lot of missing parts, but at least they admit that. Now they're showing the brown bones missing part. So they were filled using mirror images of bones that were found, fossils from other individuals of Lucy's species, and knowledge of human anatomy. Okay, so you just kind of read that. But then you think about, okay, what did they just say? They assumed Lucy was human before while they were constructing it. And so if I was to, say construct a pig fossil using a knowledge of chicken anatomy, you see what I'm saying? So you're going to be off, And so they've already pre-assumed that Lucy somehow, was an ape trying to turn into a human. And so that was, that was kind of interesting. And then again, there's some BBC specials and others where they actually admit that the hip bones were intentionally altered to try to make Lucy's hips and pelvis look more human. And so that seems to still be today. But again, it's just this whole idea what's driving it is they're trying to interpret this fossil to say that somehow apes turned into humans.
Is that a photo?
Yes, yeah.
That's not human. You won't ever see a human hand hanging on by its knees.
Oh, okay.
That cannot be human.
Yeah. So that's they'll probably fix that. But anyway, it's just a reconstruction. But at least they're starting to show more curved hands, more curved feet, things like that. So then again, but it does mention, to their credit, but again, this has been 10 years in the making. That the toe bones are longer and more curved than those of modern humans, more like those of tree-climbing apes. Okay, so again, things are just I don't want to give them too much credit, but things might be moving in the right direction. But then the problem is so that's at the start of the exhibit. Well, then you start going through the exhibit, and they just keep nudging the audience towards this idea that apes turned into humans. So this is one of those artistic things that I can't explain, but you notice that facial expression. An artist can take the same skull and either give it like a human look or a ape look. So they start looking at, start trying to make the facial expressions look more human as you go through the exhibit. And they spotlight the toe, and you notice that the feet start looking more human as you go through the exhibit. Then it gets really bad. So this is an exhibit where you have now the chimpanzee is just doing the same thing the person is, at the top there. That chimpanzee is just thinking about contemplating something, just like the human is. Then I wish you could, I don't know if you can see too well, that center picture. Now you have what's supposedly Lucy. Well, now boy, it's walking completely upright. The feet are human, the hands are human, and it's looking, he or she is looking over at a friend asking them if they're going to go to the ball game this afternoon. And so again, as you're working through this is more, so you had a little bit of the evidence, and then it's just, we're nudging people more and more into this direction. And so just the sad thing about it, and again, I'm not sure, what the best way to handle it is. I'm sure this is true at museums all over the world, is, there's really good families there. This was, I think, it was a Monday afternoon. Parents had either taken their kids out of school, or they were homeschooling them. They're in the museum. They're trying to get their kids excited about things and teach them about. But it's just a completely misleading exhibit. Spent hundreds of millions of dollars on this exhibit, but much of it was completely misleading. And so that's, again, just shows kind of the challenge. But again, just the fossil record, again, completely consistent with the Bible. We don't see transitional forms. We know that more from genetics, and I think the reason to go with fossils, you had like the feathers for T-Rex, the tooth that became Nebraska, man, many examples like that, is just because it is such vague evidence. To me, it's almost like, if you're ever out, or maybe you remember as a child, you look up in the sky and you see clouds going by, and you watch a couple of 5-year-olds, and they'll argue for a long time about whether it's a cow or a rhinoceros floating by. Well, it's neither one, but it's pretty vague evidence. And so you can make it whatever you want it to. Well, they do a lot of the same with the fossil record. And so that's the point. So these things are being spun to try to show, say, apes turned into humans or one kind of animal turned into another. We know it's not true for many reasons, but that's still a very out there, taught in a lot of different venues. Again, just finish this section with just Genesis 1:26, 27. I'll leave that on the screen. Let's take about a 5-minute break, and then boy, if you're interested, I'd love to have you. I think radiocarbon dating and radiometric dating, they're really important topics. So if you are able to stay, that's what we'll talk about next, and we'll go through it as quickly as possible, but it is a little bit of a detailed subject, but we'll definitely have you out before dark. So, all right. all right, great. Well, all right, well, thank you very much, and we'll just reconvene in about 5 minutes or so. So thanks.
Ricky's dad. Why don't let him come sit here? Let Grandpa come sit here. We're going to have a little bit more, we're going to deal with the carbon dating and a few other aspects, and then we're going to have some questions. So please, if you've got some questions, I think, Joran, would it be helpful if folk move a little bit forward, obviously keeping the social distancing vibe, so that, you know, then it is a shorter distance for you to run, if that makes sense. Okay, super. Charlie Harris, Joran doesn't mind running. Brethren, we're back for the last part of our session, and we're going to give over to Mike straight away. And we want to just say thank you so much, guys, for really keeping to the time frames. We really appreciate it. Mike, I'll give over to you immediately.
Okay, well, thank you again, and again, we'll continue on with the radiocarbon dating, radiometric dating. I did have one, I guess we'll call it a go back. Another really strong evidence for the flood is and someone mentioned this to me during the break, is actually the strata. So if we look at the strata that's laid down, we'll notice that there's no erosion between the strata. And so, so for example, where I live, they were putting in a shopping center, and they had the whole area kind of graded, and ready to build on. And then, unfortunately, I think they went bankrupt or something, so they didn't build right away. And so you could just watch, but like the first week, there was a few plants popping up. Then we had a big rainstorm, and there was all these channels carved into it. And within a few years, you couldn't even tell they'd graded that land. And so when we see these strata, that supposedly took millions of years to be deposited, there's no erosion. There's no evidence of animals or plants or anything. And so that's more evidence for the flood. So thank you for mentioning that to me. Also did want to do just a quick review of some of what we talked about this morning. Again, we talked about the fact that we can choose tells us how we should choose. And that's a tricky one. But again, you just have to think about it. Even, we're all several thousand trillion atoms. I have a few trillion more than most of you, but the whole idea is if that's all we were, when push came to shove, it would just be all my thoughts and decisions and choices would just be which atom happened to be next to which other atom at a certain pH and a certain temperature and a certain concentration. So for us to to truly be able to make any decision, we have to have a spirit or a soul. And then we talked about, the Bible answers all of our questions. We used the one about if God created the universe, who made God? And that was just because God's outside of time. He created time. He has to be outside of time by definition. He could not have had a beginning, and he cannot have an end. So that was Then, let's see, we talked about just the idea of life somehow making itself is more absurd than a jet airplane making itself. And we got a little tiny bit into the biochemistry, but really it also just comes down to we can make jet airplanes. We can't make life. And so that was another potential topic. Then I think, we started talking about this idea, okay, suppose life somehow did make itself. Could you really add information to the genome? In other words, could you turn that, say a bacteria or a mosquito turn itself into all the other life around us? And of course, everything we know from true science says that's not true. But what we do observe from true science is completely consistent with the Bible, that the original created kinds had a tremendous amount of genetic information in them. And what we see is just that different combinations of that information. We have new breeds of dogs and cats. Of course, we have had mutations in natural selection also acting on, but it's all from an original set of information. And the idea that genetic information could just make itself, again, it goes against what we know about true science. I talked a little bit about, used to be this idea of vestigial organs that had no, organs and structures that had no function. That was put to rest in 2003 when we discovered all the important functions of the appendix. And so we know that's not true. The homologous structures, the idea that because there's physical similarities between life, somehow that shows one kind of life turned into another kind of life. That's totally consistent with God creating all life. We expect the physical similarities, but as is on the screen right now, Genesis 1:26 through 27, only people are made in God's image. And so that's the important thing. And then, of course, we also talked about just the tremendous importance to our societies and really to people's eternities about staying focused on the spiritual and not the physical. And 100 years ago, we went through some horrible things prior to World War II, and of course during World War II. But unfortunately, a lot of those same ideas are starting to come back. They have different technology and different ways that they're presented to us, but those ideas are starting to come back. So that will be a challenge that the church will face. And then, of course, then we also talked about just the flood and the fossil record, all the evidence that we have, all the biblical evidence for the flood and for the fossil record, and then also the Big Bang, and just the idea, just it's a completely non-scientific theory. And again, all of the we'd known that, but we're doing just like what the supporters of Ptolemy's idea that everything revolved around the Earth. And in that case, he added what he called epicycles. We're adding things like dark matter, dark energy, inflation, other things to try to pretend that the Big Bang is somehow a correct theory. So I know lots of other things, and we will have plenty of time for questions and answers afterwards, but I know a lot of people were interested in radiometric dating, so wanted to talk some about that. And let me I'll go back. Let's see, I think it's back here. Sorry, I should have set up before. Okay, so I guess we'll start out first of all talking age of the Earth, and just in that context. Again, want to emphasize evolution doesn't work no matter how old the Earth is, and so that's an important point. We gave those examples this morning, but where this does become an important point, it is one way that basically people opposed to the Bible will try to lead Christians astray. In other words, they'll try to say, well, so we can say, well, it doesn't matter how old the Earth is, evolution doesn't work. That's a true statement. But someone might say, well, boy, if I read Genesis and I look at the Bible, and there's no way you can get the Earth being billions of years old out of that without really distorting Scripture. And once a person feels like they have to distort Scripture, it's easy for them to think, well, I could never understand this, or I could never interpret this correctly. So it is actually a very important topic. It's again, just along this idea of the age of the Earth. This is even Carl Sagan. He was a famous evolutionist. He says, well, it's clear that one could randomly assemble all the elementary particles in the universe 1 billion times a second for the age of the universe and never get this protein. And so because he had personally calculated a 1 and 1 followed by 130 zeros odds of random formation of a single protein. So again, even he knows that age doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how old the Earth is. But a few sentences later, he says, there's no doubt about the fact of evolution. Okay? So he just said evolution can't work. I mean, just based on that first, this is literally on the same page. If you get his book, this is Communication with Extraterrestrial Intelligence. Same book. And this was, it was an older quote, 1973, because again, we saw the quote recently saying, well, there's no extraterrestrial intelligences. So again, things change. They always move in direction of favoring the Bible. But he says, no doubt about the fact of evolution, but there are still sizable questions on the mechanics of the evolutionary process. So again, but again, at least admission that age doesn't matter. So when you get to radiometric dating, there's 3 assumptions that typically have to be made. The first is the degree to which radioactive decay rates have fluctuated through the life of the sample being dated. Now, typically, it's assumed that they've never fluctuated. And so we'll talk about that. I think it's next. The second was the original concentration of the isotopes being used to date the sample, and the third is the addition or subtraction of isotopes being used to date the sample. So those are kind of the 3 fundamental assumptions. And so if we had changes in decay rates during creation week and or the flood, it would have a significant impact on the estimated ages. So that's kind of a key is, are those decay rates constant? Well, at least when I was going through school, we were told that they were constant. But in 2006, that's when it first started being reported that even today we see fluctuations in decay rates. Okay, so these were it's mainly a professor emeritus at Stanford that's really been pursuing this, and there's evidence from Purdue University. These are pretty famous universities in the United States, just saying that you have this evidence for fluctuating decay rates. And so, but the idea is, okay, we look around, things are pretty physically stable right now, and we see changes in decay rates. Well, what about creation week or the flood? Because we still don't, his theory, and I think we have a couple of quotes, he's thinking it's either neutrinos but a lot of people are saying it's more likely it's a particle we haven't even discovered yet. Okay, so we don't know what's causing these fluctuations, but we measure them, and we know that they're actually occurring. So when things are physically stable now, when we see fluctuations, well, what might have been occurring during creation week or the flood? Okay, so now I feel like it's 1907, and we're talking about the human civilization on Mars. Okay, and what I mean by that is, we got this much data, and we're just starting to realize. They were probably just starting to realize maybe by 1920 they were starting to realize, hey, there aren't people running around on Mars. Okay, and so now we're just starting to realize that, hey, these decay rates, they're not constant. And so now what are all the implications back to creationism? But if you have changes in decay rates, then that, the whole argument of radiometric dating essentially goes away. And so that's just one and the argument that the radiometric dating somehow shows the Earth is much older than the Bible indicates. Now, I think there's a slide in here we talk about there are literally dozens of ways to estimate the age of the Earth, and probably 80 to 90% of those are completely consistent with the Earth being a few thousand years old. So I wanted to mention that this idea of radiometric dating, it's the outlier. If I look at how fast like salt is accumulating in the oceans and how much salt is in the oceans, completely consistent with the Earth being a few thousand years old. If I look at the rate that sediment is being washed into the oceans, the rate that is being removed through plate tectonics, completely consistent with the Earth being a few thousand years old. If I look at the energy in the Earth's magnetic field and how it appears to be decaying in reasonable ways for there to be a magnetic field at all, completely consistent with the Earth being a few thousand years old. In fact, in that case, it limits the age of the Earth to around 20,000 years. So again, all of these ways to estimate the age of the Earth are consistent with the Bible. Radiometric dating with certain assumptions is how we get these billions of years. And so I just want to, and so one of the ones that, again, is being thought of now, there are other ways that those radiometric dates could be wrong, but this is the one, just because it's recent. It was only about 15 years ago when it really started. They think they started noticing it in the 80s, but it really only started getting publicized about 15 years ago, that we see, and it's just basically medical isotopes, and we measure the decay rates of the medical isotopes, other isotopes, and we see that they fluctuate. And so it's again very interesting. This is an article from Popular Science. It's back 2010. It says the sun at 93 million miles away appears to be influencing the decay of radioactive elements inside the Earth, researchers say. A study by Stanford and Purdue scientists found that the core of the sun, where nuclear reactions produce neutrinos, spins more slowly than the surface. This phenomenon might explain changing rates of radioactive decay scientists observed at 2 separate labs, but does not explain why the decay change happens. That violates the laws of physics as we know them. The article asks, how could the nebulous neutrino, which does not interact with normal matter, be affecting decay rates? No one knows. It might be a previously unknown particle instead. And so, so it's just kind of, it's great that when they say that violates the laws of physics as we know them, it's important for people to keep that in mind. And when we talk about, there's certain things we're very confident in, but there's other things that we're not. And so this was one we were very confident in, but then all of a sudden, again, this is measurements. This is actual data. This was a Stanford University. This was a release from them in 2016. It says the research that Sturek learned about in Tucson concerned fluctuations in the rate of decay of radioactive elements. The fluctuations were highly controversial at the time because it had been thought that the decay rate of any radioactive element was constant. Sturek decided to study these experimental results using analytical techniques that he and Scargill had developed to study neutrinos. So again, he's trying to apply. This is what's exciting, is people are now trying to make commercial products. In this case, it'd be like a neutrino detector or maybe a solar flare detector from this from this observation. And the reason that's exciting is once people start doing that, that's be incentive to investigate it more, to learn more about it. And so again, I'm hopeful that this area of research will continue and grow. And then another quote says, in examining the radioactive decay fluctuations, the team found evidence that those fluctuations matched patterns they had found in the Super Kamiokande neutrino data, each indicating a 1-month oscillation attributed to solar rotation. So basically, they're trying to figure out what this particle is, and he's trying to apply it to neutrinos. He might be right. Could be a completely new particle, like the other article said. But again, it's just exciting that they're seeing they're starting to try to figure out what's causing these fluctuations, because again, that's very scientifically it's very important, and at least for now they're being allowed to pursue the research, because again, the idea is, well, the fluctuations are small today, so they won't at today's rate, they don't really they're not a threat to evolution, if you want to phrase it that way. But again, just it's to me, once we realize what's causing those fluctuations, it won't, to think things are so physically stable now and they're fluctuating, again, to have larger fluctuations during creation or week of the flood, it's not at all unreasonable. So, yes?
I'm asking this on behalf of a friend of ours that's watching on the internet.
Oh, great, okay.
He says, please ask him about the reversal of the expansion of the universe over the supposed 3.5 billion years. How close would the sun be to the Earth and the subsequent effects upon the Earth, etc.?
So, yeah, you have everything from the, you have the faint sun paradox, the idea that the Earth would actually be colder, billions of years ago. And so that's, and so then you have the whole idea of how planets form, which is you have to somehow have, supposedly gas giants can only be at a certain distance, and whenever we see extrasolar planets, we always find them where they're theoretically not allowed to be. You have the moon and the Earth and the distance. The moon is receding from the Earth at a certain rate. I think it's a little over an inch a year now. But if supposedly if the Earth had been that old, like a billion years ago, or a little more, then the moon would have been touching the Earth. So he's definitely there's just so many ways to show that things can't be billions of years old. So it's, I'll say excellent question. In case you can see me, I'm not even sure where the camera is, but yeah. But thank you for that question. Yeah. Okay. And so anyway, but this is really just the idea on radiometric dating, talking about it a lot now. And then this was astroparticle physics, had one in September 2012. Says additional experimental evidence presented in support of the recent hypothesis that a possible solar influence could explain fluctuations observed in the measured decay rates of some isotopes. These data were obtained during routine weekly calibrations of an instrument used for radiological safety at the Ohio State University research reactor, using in this case is chlorine-36. A detector system used is based on a Geiger-Muller gas detector, which is a robust detector system with very low susceptibility to environmental changes. Clear annual variation is evident in the data, with a maximum relative count observed in January/February and a minimum relative count observed in July/August. And so it is interesting. January, February, that's when the Earth is closest to the sun. July, August is when we're furthest from the sun. And it's just kind of interesting because you tell the great authors, but you can tell they just assume everybody knows that off the top of your head. You know what I mean? But that's part of the reason they're mentioning those as the fluctuations. And then again, they just say the annual variation. It's not from fluctuation detectors. So people are really confident that those fluctuations are happening. And then data on changing radioactive decay rates of Brookhaven National Laboratory. It's one of the national labs in the United States, Federal Physical and Technical Institute in Germany, and also both alpha and beta emitters show changes. And so again, there's a tremendous amount we could talk about this afternoon, but those are just basically one way to think about it. A gamma ray is just a real high energy photon. Just think of it as just like visible light, but really, really high energy. A beta particle is just an electron. Sometimes a nucleus will spit out, the equivalent of spitting out an electron out of the nucleus. And an alpha particle is essentially a helium nucleus. It's just like in other words, just a large isotope will just basically spit out a helium nucleus, 2 protons and 2 neutrons. But again, apologize, we'll be going kind of fast, but please stop me if you have any questions or any comments. Okay, so some of the evidence that we're having here, one is discordances between estimated ages. And so in this case, so we know that these decay rates can change, and we're trying to figure out, well, how might they have changed in the past? Is there any other evidence that they changed in the past? Well, this is, you can think about it, there's about 4 isotope chains that are sometimes used to estimate the age of say, rocks or primarily this is for rocks. And usually, we can only find maybe one of those radioactive decay chains in a rock. Well, in this case, this was where you had 3 decay chains in a rock. And so I'll just say, so you think of it now, you have 3 ways of estimating the age of this rock. And so these were the Brahma amphibolites at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. And so you see on that chart on the left, you see one was a uranium lead date, and it was 1,883 million years plus or minus 53 million years, okay? Then another dating is rubidium strontium. It was 1,240 million years, plus or minus 54 million years. And the other one was samarium neodymium, and it came out at 1,655 million years, plus or minus 40 million years. So I had 3 dating methods. At every one of the dating methods, one way to look at that chart would be to say, wow, I did it 3 different ways, and I'm not really sure exactly how old that rock is, but I know it's got to be at least 1 billion years old, right? Because you had 3 dating methods, and all 3 said it was over 1 billion years old. Okay, does anybody see why that's completely wrong? Okay, so what you really know is, if you notice those error bars on the chart on the right, you notice that the error bars, and those are plus or minus 2 sigma bars, they don't overlap. Okay, so the only thing I actually know is that at least 2 of those 3 measurements are wrong. Because they can't, 2 of the 3 have to be wrong. And if I'm using the same general assumptions, like constant radioactive decay rates or whatever assumptions are applied, there's a really good chance all 3 are wrong. But if someone just glances at that, I mean, can you imagine you're in your 8th grade earth science class and you see this chart, and you're just wanting to pass the test, or you get home, or get to, you're going to just look at that chart and say, oh, wow, we got all this evidence those rocks are over 1 billion years old. But that's not the key takeaway from this chart. Again, it's that we know at least, why don't they match? That's huge. I mean, that's the important takeaway, is those data don't match. And we see this a lot. This isn't just an isolated case. So I'll just give an analogy. I have this remote. Suppose I sent this remote off to a lab, and I said, okay, how long is this remote? Okay, and I sent it, the first lab said, well, it's 100 meters long, plus or minus a meter. Okay, and I sent it to a second lab, and it says, well, it's 200 meters long, plus or minus 2 meters. And I sent it to a third lab, and it says it's 300 meters long, plus or minus 3 meters. So I could come home and I say, oh boy, I don't really know exactly how long it is, but at least I know it's more than 100 meters, okay? So then I measure your podium, I say, okay, 100 meters, 200 meters, 300 meters. So wow, you got a 300 meter wide podium here at the congregation. Now that's a congregation, but again, the whole point is what I should have said is, wow, I think, even if I had no idea how long it was, I would at least know that it's really strange that I sent it to 3 labs, and by definition, at least 2 of them are wrong. Because it can't be 100 meters plus or minus 1 and 200 meters plus or minus and 300. At least 2 of those have to be wrong. And so, again, there's a really good chance all 3 are wrong. And so that's the case where you see discordances in radiometric dating. Another factor we see is what they call helium retention in zircons. Okay, and so that sounds really strange, but I mentioned alpha particles being emitted, and this is the case where, say, you have uranium-238 decaying to lead-206. Well, in the process, and those are just isotopes, and I think we'll get into that a little bit more in a minute here, but in the case of uranium-238 decaying into lead-206, you release 8 helium atoms. Okay, so when you read it, it's probably about every 6 months, read about they found this crystal, they found this zircon, and they assume, remember we mentioned those 3 assumptions, so they assume that when that zircon formed, it had uranium, and that's true. Uranium is a contaminant, so a certain small percentage of what's in that zircon crystal is actually uranium. And then if it's all uranium, if there was no lead when it formed, and again, I'm not saying it's a bad assumption, it's just that's the assumption. So then you look at that uranium, if it's pure uranium and it formed, then you can look at what fraction of the uranium turned into lead. Okay, so you just measure the amount of uranium in the zircon, measure the amount of lead in the zircon, and you say, okay, this fraction of uranium turned into lead. And then if you assume that uranium had the same radioactive decay rate that it has today, then you can say, okay, this is how long it would take that much uranium to turn into that much lead. So that's how that part of the dating goes. But then what's interesting is in this case, there's another way to date it. And you can say, well, how much helium is left in the zircon? Right? Because I can actually go into a lab and I can measure how fast the helium diffuses out of the zircons. And see how much helium is left. Well, it turns out a large fraction of the helium is still in that zircon. So the objective conclusion would be you did have a lot of radioactive decay, and it happened recently. And so that's what those charts are on the left. When they say creation model, what they really mean is you had creation week about 6,000 years ago, flood on the order of 4,300 years ago. And then you measure the helium retention in the zircon. In this case, they're looking at just the diffusivity. So you look at the measured diffusivity in the lab versus the data, and the creation model hits it dead on. And they actually published this before they got the data back. It's always really impressive. That's a good scientist, because he publishes what he thinks is going to happen before he if he had to send it off, because he's saying this is what my model would predict. And if it comes back way off, he doesn't start adding fudge factors and inflation and dark energy. He says, oh, I was wrong, moves on, comes up with another theory. So in this case, they hit it dead on. Now, when they say uniformitarian model, that means this idea that the Earth's 4.54 billion years old and all this decay happened over that length of time. It's off by a factor of 100,000. Okay, so that's a big difference. But the idea is, maybe a way to think about it is if I'd walked in here today and there was a helium balloon up on the ceiling, I'd have probably thought, oh wow, they must have had a birthday party here or something. Maybe yesterday, or the day before. And if someone had come up to me and said, no, when they were building the building, someone let go of a helium balloon and it's been up there ever since, I'd be like, that doesn't seem quite right, because helium balloon, the helium diffuses out and it's down on the floor pretty quick. And so, but that's basically the same thing. We know that if that decay had happened over a very long period of time, there wouldn't be helium left in those zircons, but we still see it. And so that's very again, very good evidence. Very consistent. The objective way of interpreting this is, there was a lot of uranium turned into lead, assuming that first assumption was right. There wasn't any lead at the start. A lot of uranium turned into lead, and then, but it had to happen within the past few thousand years. So the question.
If I'm hearing you correct, I hear that there are some inputs or information being put into the process, and therefore some of the outcomes are inconsistent or different.
Yeah, it's all about the assumptions. And so we'll talk about that when we get to the carbon dating. The measurements are actually very accurate. So like with carbon dating, with accelerator mass spectrometers, we can measure the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon really, really accurately. So that's not the question. It's not the actual scientific measurements. It's what assumptions we apply to those measurements. So it's a little bit analogous to like the assumption that the Nebraska man, that tooth was a human, and but that's kind of an extreme example. But in this case, it's usually what were the concentrations of the isotopes at the start? What were the decay rates, and were there any isotopes moving in or out? Over the however long a period of time it was. But you're absolutely right. It's not the actual measurements we've gotten very good at. It's the assumptions we apply to those measurements. Okay, great question. Thanks. Okay, as some of the discussion points people mentioned, if radioactive decay rates were greatly accelerated, wouldn't the resulting energy melt the Earth? So that's kind of an interesting question. At least people are thinking, because they think, well, you get this much energy per decay, so if you had that much energy released all at once, would you melt the Earth? Well, but the point is, we don't know how they changed. So again, I'd go about it the other way, just say, okay, so technically, we have all this evidence that they changed. We know from the Bible that there's, and other data, but that all this decay happened relatively recently. So what mechanisms for changing those decay rates could there be that would keep that energy release reasonable? So that's a clue. Again, talk about the stretching of space as one option, and again, but also just other ways that people are starting to hypothesize about how to change decay rates. So again, I'll just say again, it's 1907, and we're talking about the human civilization on Mars. I mean, we're starting to realize, hey, that's probably, there's a lot more here that we need to learn, but we're just now learning it. There are ways that we have accelerated radioactive decay in the lab, a lot of different ways. Most of them are pretty extreme. This was one they actually said was, it's actually reasonably mild. They said ultrasonic cavitation of water speeds up thorium decay. So this was from the CERN courier. CERN is a famous lab. It just says, common belief that radioactive decay rates are unchanged by external conditions, despite many examples of small shifts being well documented and understood. However, Fabio Cardoni of the Institute por el Estudio de Material and Nanostructura and Roman colleagues have shown a dramatic increase by a factor of 10,000 in the decay rate of thorium-228 in water as a result of ultrasonic cavitation. So again, they didn't say they knew why, but it was kind of just an interesting observation. People are starting to look at how these decay rates could have changed, and then of course we're just measuring them changing naturally, and then talk a little bit about just the flood and some of the changes that we had. There are, meaning there was a tremendous cavitation during the flood, just as an observation more for the flood. Now, we also have inaccurate dates, and a lot of times we read these, and you read them, and it's just kind of, you just think of it as humorous. Just kind of, that's kind of funny. And a lot of times it's because there'll be like a volcano that erupted recently, and they'll do a date on it, and they'll say it's 3.5 million years old or something. And so that's happened to like Mount St. Helens or some other volcanoes. I think this was a volcano in New Zealand where they say, yeah, because people saw it erupt. Yeah, we know Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980. We know this particular volcano erupted in 1954. But then they'll go in, they'll do a radiometric date, and they'll say, oh, it's millions of years old, and then some say, oh, well, we have to correct it, and so it's just kind of one of those humor articles, but it can actually do a lot of damage. And so, so for example, there are museums where they'll say this volcano was dated to have erupted 500,000 years ago. Okay, so just think of where this is going. So they say it erupted 500,000 years ago. Well, all we know is that it wasn't recorded. So in other words, no one recorded it. They will say it was 500,000 years ago, but they don't make any corrections to that date. And they don't mention that, well, wait, using those same techniques, we can say a volcano that erupted a couple decades ago that people saw, we'll say that it erupted 3.5 million years ago, and everybody just laughs about it. So that volcano, so now we have a volcano that dates out to 500,000 years ago. Well, again, it probably erupted, hundreds of years ago maybe, but there's no correction, and so it just plants that seed that, well, maybe the Bible's wrong. Maybe this really did erupt 500,000. So do you see the subtlety there? I mean, we know that dating method is off by millions of years, and then we make corrections to it, on purpose, because we can say we dated it, and oh, here's the correction factor we used, and it all comes down to like how much argon is retained in the lava, how fast the lava cools. So so they have explanations for why it's off, but they correct for it. But then you find a sample where there's no eyewitness, and just all of a sudden they'll just throw out there, oh, it's, and the real idea is we have no idea how old that volcano was. We just know it wasn't recorded. But that's not how it's often presented. So that's again, a potentially, a damaging application of this. And then, again, we have carbon dating. Let me go back then, and let's talk about carbon dating now. I did these just a little bit out of order. So that's just radiometric dating. So that's these dates that sometimes people use to say that the Earth is, billions of years old. Now, carbon dating, it's usually used when people are trying to say that the Earth is, like say artifacts are like tens of thousands of years old. And I'll explain the reason why. So those were the radiometric dating methods. Now, with carbon dating, this is again, important point to make is again, most of the dating methods we have, they're very consistent with the Earth just being a few thousand years old. Talked about very little sediment on the seafloor. We talked about the bent rock layers. Sediment had to be laid down quickly. Talked about soft tissue and fossils. Now what this is this was also again in the early 2000s. I think it was 2005, 2006. They started finding soft tissue in dinosaur bones. And at least when I was growing up, we were told, well, you'll never find, soft tissue, proteins or red blood cells or something in dinosaur bones because they're too old. 65 million years old, they couldn't survive that long. Well, they started finding it. They sectioned bones, and they would find proteins and red blood cells and all kinds of soft. Even talked about maybe finding, tissue. And when it was first reported, and it was again an evolutionist, but she's a good scientist. It was Mary Swikert. I think might have a picture here, but if not, you can look her up. And she started reporting. Well, she got just attacked. Oh, you have to be wrong. You must have done your data wrong. It must be contaminated. And but it turns out she was right. Now people are finding this soft tissue all the time. And so it's very strong evidence that those dinosaur bones are only a few thousand years old. But it's really interesting. It's kind of the same thing. Well, we know that they're 65 billion years old. And we really don't know how that soft tissue could be there, but it doesn't matter because we know that they're 65 billion. So it's really interesting how that just got dismissed. But again, very strong evidence for the Earth being a few thousand years old. Rapidly decaying magnetic field. Earth's magnetic field, it looks like it's decaying exponentially, and this is the total energy in the magnetic field. We can have direct measurements back 150, 200 years. We can have really good idea what it was like, say 1,000 years ago. And again, this is the total energy in the magnetic field. It's decaying exponentially, which would be exactly what we'd expect if there was a magnetic field at creation, and then it's just slowly decaying due to resistance in the iron core. So there's, again, very biblically consistent models. They also actually predict very well the magnetic fields of other bodies in the solar system. But just the rate that's decaying on that exponential, that actually limits the age of the Earth to less than 20,000 years. Doesn't mean it's 20,000 years old, it's just that would be a maximum. And so again, that's a fascinating topic. We mentioned the helium and radioactive rocks. Again, we see so much helium in zircons that helium had to be put there within the past few thousand years from radioactive decay. Now we're going to talk about carbon-14. And carbon-14, we see it in fossils, coal, and diamonds. And just one way to think about it is carbon-14 has a 5,730 year half-life. So that means half of it goes away every 5,730 years. So what that does is, even with our best technology, after 100,000 years, there'd be no carbon-14 left. Because just think, a half after 5,730 years, you're down to a fourth after 11,460 years. And keeps cutting in half, but we still find it. We see it in fossils, we see it in coal, we see it in diamonds. But you go to a good jewelry store, one of the ways they're going to impress us into buying diamonds from them is they'll say, "Oh, this diamond was made 1 billion years ago." Well, no, because it's got carbon-14 in it. So we know it had to have formed very recently. And then very little salt in the sea. This is just, we know how fast salt's being added to the oceans, how fast it's being removed. And then we even see DNA in what's called ancient bacteria. What's fascinating there is there've been, essentially, it's the same as DNA in bacteria today. And we can measure the mutation rates in bacteria. And so we know, even though it's dated as being ancient, we know it had to be very recent. So many ways to date the age of the Earth. And again, almost all of them are consistent with the Earth being a few thousand years old. With just only radiometric dating with certain assumptions do we get these long ages. But unfortunately, those are the ones that get reported. Again, I don't want to, it's just, that's the society we're in right now. Again, I talked just a little bit about the different decay chains and the different radiometric dating methods. I think we've talked about a lot of that. So now I want to talk about radiocarbon dating, because that's example. So they're all based on a decay chain, but with radiocarbon, what happens is when an organism's alive, it's taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. And so right now, carbon dioxide, carbon has 3 isotopes. Okay, so carbon always has 6 protons. And almost, most carbon, 99% or so, has 6 protons, 6 neutrons. And that's carbon-12, just 6 plus 6 is 12. Then you have carbon-13, that's 6 protons and 7 neutrons, and it's also non-radioactive, and it's a much smaller fraction. Then you have carbon-14, that's 6 protons and 8 neutrons. Now, carbon-14 is the isotope that's used in carbon dating. And so it has the 5,730 year half-life. So the idea is like this podium it's made out of wood. And say it was cut down from a tree very recently and made into this podium. Well, while that tree was growing, the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon was about 1 in a trillion. It's a little less than that, but just for round numbers, we'll say it's 1 in a trillion. Okay, so 1 out of every trillion carbon-14, or I'm sorry, 1 out of every trillion carbon atoms in this podium, it's going to be carbon-14. So now, say someone is using the same podium 5,730 years from now. Okay, well, 5,730 years from now also only 1 in 2 trillion carbon-14s. Carbon atoms will be carbon-14 because half of them will have decayed away. Okay, so you kind of see how that works? So right now it's 1 in a trillion. Every half-life, half of them go away. So 5,730 years from now, it'll only be 1 in 2 trillion. Wait another 5,730 years, it'll be 1 in 4 trillion. Wait another 5,730 years, it'll be 1 in 8 trillion. Then 1 in 16 trillion, 1 in 32 trillion. So you kind of see how it works. So that's really the basis behind carbon dating and also all kinds of radiometric dating. Now, but the key assumption was that we knew. Many key assumptions, but one was we knew what the carbon-14 to carbon ratio was when this wood was formed. Now we know it because we can measure it today. We know when the tree was growing. We've measured it back a few years. So a pretty good idea today. But if we find an artifact, we don't know what that ratio was when that artifact was formed. So that's one. And of course, we do have possible changing radioactive decay rates. But that's, those 2 factors really have a huge effect. So everyone, and the way the carbon-14 is formed, one of probably the primary ways just have a cosmic ray comes into the atmosphere. It interacts with a nitrogen or anything in the atmosphere, kicks off a neutron. Then when that neutron gets absorbed by a nitrogen-14, it basically causes a nuclear reaction where a neutron's absorbed and a proton's kicked out. And so you turn a nitrogen-14 into a carbon-14 that way. Okay, so everyone, or back to anyone reasonably clear on how that works? Okay, so that's basically the assumptions behind carbon-14 dating. So I think we talked about this. But again, the actual measurement, the only thing we're measuring today is this ratio of carbon-14 to carbon. And so when someone comes out with a date, it's all based on the assumptions. And so, but again, it's very deceptive. You'll have people say, we now can, carbon dating, we can do it within 100 years. And you're like, okay, what are they talking about? Well, you push them on it, and they just say that the accelerator mass spectrometers are getting so good that we can very accurately measure this carbon-14 to carbon ratio. Well, I agree completely with that. I mean, we've got really good laboratory equipment. We can measure that ratio very accurately, but again, it's all in the assumptions. So we're very confident in the actual number we get, but it's just like what assumptions are applied to that. And so, again, want to, really emphasize that. Okay, so now we're really after lunch, so we'll do a little more math. But just to keep it, I just want to show again that really we won't necessarily go through this, but there's just a very standard equation that's used. And so this is just I put it in words at the top. The carbon-14 concentration in the sample is just the initial carbon-14 ratio, which I said carbon-14 concentration in the sample at death. And then it's e to the negative lambda t. And so lambda is just is 0.6931 divided by the carbon-14 half-life. And you have to keep all the units consistent. T, of course, is time, which has to be consistent with what you use for lambda. E is the base of natural logarithms, and then the concentration. So the equation is just written C equals C0 e to the negative lambda t. The only reason I mention this is it's very quantitative, the calculation, but it's all in the assumptions. Okay, and so in this case, let's make uniformitarian assumptions. So these are the assumptions that an atheist would typically make. And just suppose the carbon-14 concentration is sample 2% of the atmospheric concentration today. So again, we talked about, you go a half, a fourth, an eighth, a 16th, a 32nd, a 64th. So say we had a sample, and we know what the concentration is today, and in that sample it's 2%. Okay, well, if we assume that when that sample was formed, that carbon-14 to carbon ratio was the same as today, that would be what they call a uniformitarian assumption. We run it through the numbers, we get the decay constant, make that assumption, and again, sometimes, small adjustments are made, but, make that basic assumption. Then we run through the equations. We say, well, say that's a wooden bowl or some piece of, some artifact. We'd make, with those assumptions, we'd say, wow, it's 32,330 years old. Okay, now using the same exact equation, the same measured data, but say we take into account reasonable effects of the flood. And so a lot of effects, and we'll talk about all the different effects, but during the flood, think of it as all the coal and oil and natural gas being buried during the flood. We do the models and we show, the Earth could have had that much carbon in the biosphere. Even you go up to any museum, even atheists now will say that the amount of carbon in the biosphere was much greater in the past than it is today, and it could have been up to a factor 200 greater. Well, so the flood would have just dramatically changed this ratio of carbon-14 to carbon. And you even get things like the fountains of the great deep heating the oceans. The oceans heat up, they release CO2. All kinds of things are affecting this ratio. So when a civilization popped up shortly after the flood, it's going to have a different carbon-14 to carbon ratio. So now, again, it could have changed by well over a factor of 100, but say it just changed by a factor of 30. Okay, so now I have this same equation, the same equipment measuring the data, but say it was 1/30 of today's atmospheric C14 concentration. Again, using the same everything, I get a date of 4,210 years. Now, all of a sudden, it's like, hey, that's reasonable. It might be off because I'm still making assumptions, but that's reasonable. And so it's all based on those assumptions. Now, so I'm just looking at the flood, the amount of carbon that was buried, the fact of what was released back from the oceans after the flood, if the oceans were warmer. So have all these factors. There's many other things, other factors. Mentioned that carbon-14 is made by cosmic rays. Well, the Earth's magnetic field was stronger in their past. Less cosmic rays hitting the atmosphere, less carbon-14 produced, a lower ratio would make things look older. The sun's magnetic field may have been stronger in the past, less cosmic rays getting into the inner solar system. How much carbon-14 was in the original creation? That's a really mean question because it's nowhere in the Bible. But it's because we don't know. So all of these factors that would change that ratio. So yeah, question.
So carbon dating is based on the assumption that the carbon-14 is half-life is 5,730 years old. But
Right.
there's no way of substantiating that 5,730.
Yeah, so we can measure that today. So one assumption that's always been 5,730, and so that would have been the fluctuations. And then the other really big assumption is that say when this wooden bowl or whatever it was dated at 32,330 years, they were assuming that the tree that was used to make that wooden bowl, that when that tree was growing, the carbon-14 to carbon ratio was the same as it is today. And that, may or may not have been true. When you get those dates, it's not true, based on the other discussions. But we know that ratio would have changed dramatically around the flood. Now, I should mention, within a few centuries after the flood, we would expect the carbon-14 to carbon ratio to somewhat stabilize. That was kind of the last major physical event. Very physically catastrophic event. So you'd actually expect, say something's like 3,000 years old, we would actually expect the carbon dating to be reasonable. But when you get back closer to the flood, that's when you would see these potential for very large fluctuations depending on the effects of the flood on this carbon-14 to carbon ratio. So I tend to, the assumptions aren't, like say someone carbon dates something 1,000 years old, I tend to, that's the assumptions that are made either based biblically or non-biblically are very similar at that point.
Yeah, there's an assumption right now that the burning of fossil fuels are harming the correct dating of what we're talking about here.
Right.
Is there a truism there?
So it will change. So most coal and diamonds have about 1/30th of the, I think it's 1/30th of the carbon-14 to carbon ratio that we see today. And so that's so that will affect the ratio if we burn it. Now we're releasing carbon that only has about 1/30th of the carbon-14 to carbon ratio that we see today. Now, again, what's interesting is if I want to look at it a different way, okay, that would be about 5 half-lives. So that's saying that coal, oil, natural gas would have been formed, say on the order of 30,000 years ago. And so you say, okay, that's older than the Bible would say, but most, if you look at when they say coal was formed, they never say 30,000 years. And so it wasn't. It was formed during the flood about 4,000 years ago. And that goes back to the amount of carbon-14 in the original creation and cosmic ray fluxes and everything else. But it's just kind of interesting. They kind of self-contradict themselves because they'll say the carbon-14 concentration in coal is about 1/30th of what, in a lot of coal, it's about, samples are about 1/30th of what we see today, maybe down to 100th. But the fact that there's any carbon-14 in the coal at all shows that it's not nearly as old as what they claim. I get it. Yep. But it would affect the ratio. Yep. And then they'll, so it's, okay. Okay, so boy, I feel like we're going pretty fast, but is that, any other questions, comments? Okay, so then, again, talk about how can there be carbon-14 in coal and diamonds supposedly millions of years old? There can't be. Now, coal, they'll try to come up with ways it could have been contaminated or something. That doesn't work. Diamonds, though, even coal or diamonds, but diamonds is such a very good crystal structure. You just can't move carbon-14 in and out of a diamond. And so the fact that we detect carbon-14 in diamonds, and it's the same thing when people, when scientists reported soft tissue in dinosaur bones, and everybody tried to say, oh, you did your experiment wrong, those contamination things. It wasn't. She did it right. And it's the same thing now with diamonds. They used to say, oh, well, it's contamination, it's this, that. No, it's not. They've checked it. It's there. So again, that's very powerful evidence that the Earth is, just again, very consistent with the biblical age of a few thousand years. Again, we don't know how much carbon-14 was originally in the Earth, how it was distributed. Radioactive decay rates being accelerated during creation week of the flood. Cosmic ray flux or spectrum different in the past. Variations in solar activity, variations in the Earth's magnetic field. And again, the CO2 concentration of the air different in the past. And then also CO2 released from the oceans, if the oceans warmed during and after the flood. So all of those different all of those different mechanisms. I tried to go out online and see if there was any rebuttal at all, and it was just there was nothing. No one had. They would say, one was like, well, I called my friend who worked here, and he had a neighbor whose cousin told him this. I mean, it's just like, but there was this idea. Well, maybe somehow the carbon-14 is formed in situ, and we know again just from true science, from true calculations, it can't happen. You'd literally one of the ones you'd have to. Like for carbon, you could say if you had one uranium atom for every 2 carbon atoms, you could, but you think about 1 uranium atom for every 2 carbon atoms, the measured value is like 1 uranium atom per 100,000 carbon atoms. It just doesn't, so I would just say grasping at straws, trying to figure out how to explain this. And then you can point out, well, you'd have the same effect if radioactive decay rates were accelerated, but it's, it still doesn't explain the distribution of carbon-14, in diamonds, things like that. So it's just not a, so again, it's just 100% biblically consistent, 100% consistent with the Earth being a few thousand years old and essentially impossible to be explained any other way. So it's basically ignored. And that's the, again, just like, some of the other topics that we've discussed. Yeah.
So if I understand correctly, the flood would be a benchmark for us by which to date the Earth.
Yes,
Would that be
so
correct?
the flood...
the flood would be a benchmark to date the Earth.
Yeah, so you have the genealogies before the flood, the 1656 years or so, and then you had the flood, and then... and then we have good genealogies after the flood. And so, but again, there's discussion, and so that's why I usually just stay with less than 10,000 years old. I don't want to, if someone, if I'm say 6,200 years old, someone says no, it's 6,270 years old. I don't want to. That's not a. Yeah, I'm sorry. That goes back to just hey, look, we need to stay unified. There's a huge problem here. So, but yeah, it's. And again, should mention again, we won't have time today. It's fun just talking about these ancient civilizations and all of the technology they had. And we find that now archaeologically. But I always think of it, well, you had 1,656 years between creation and the flood. Everybody spoke the same language, and everybody had better physically, their brains were better. I mean, not, that's just, because we didn't have the mutations and so, wow, it's hard to imagine what kind of technology they might have had and what carried through the flood. But that to me is very consistent with, that's why the Great Pyramid is the best pyramid, because they were closest to Noah and his family, who obviously knew how to build the ark and had all that carried through the flood, and so they could obviously knew how to build things, and so it gets very consistent. Another fascinating discussion, but the flood is a very key event that again people ignore, just like it says people will ignore, and so it's now some people say, well, can we use archaeology to calibrate carbon dating? In other words, can we find an artifact? And a lot of times we'll say, well, we found this piece of pottery that's, say, 10,000 years old. And then they'll say, well, how do you know that? Well, it was the layer that the pottery was found in, or it was the amount of residue on the pottery, or it was the style of the pottery. But you think about, well, none of that gives us an absolute date. So you push on that, and what you find out is it's all eventually goes back to carbon dating. Because at some point they had found pottery of that style with that amount of residue, in that certain layer, that they could also do carbon dating on, and that's how they concluded that any pottery with that style and that layer with that amount of residue was say 10,000 years old. Well, so the problem is if that calibration was wrong, if the carbon dating was wrong, then all of those other assumptions are wrong also. So again, I mentioned that you guys had a 300-meter diameter podium here. Well, that was because I said this is 100 meters long, and then I measured this, and then I said so this is 300 meters long. Then I took the podium and I measured your table. So now not only does this congregation have a 300-meter thick or wide podium, it has tables that are kilometers long. Think of the potlucks. I mean, so it's it's just once that initial calibration is wrong, everything based on that calibration is wrong also. So if someone says they calibrated it based on carbon dating, and then they calibrated that based on pottery style, and then they did that based on so you can have something that's like many steps removed from that initial carbon date, but if that carbon date was wrong, it's still wrong. And so really the opposite has occurred. So a lot of because sometimes there'll be archaeological dates that say, oh, this dig was, 10,000 years old, 20,000 years old. Well, that's not really a biblical date. But again, it's either carbon dating or tree ring dating. And tree ring dating often brings in carbon dating. But even when it doesn't, you think of, well, what about the post-flood climate? How different was that compared to the climate now? We see much evidence even now where trees will get multiple rings each year. So again, it's all goes back to what the assumptions are. And then, there's other isotopes, beryllium-10, chlorine-36. But again, you look at any of the isotopes that are used for this, and again, it's very assumption-driven, and with assumptions, especially taking into account effects of the flood, it all becomes very biblically consistent. So again, advances in true science have shown radiocarbon dating to be fully consistent with the Bible. Genesis 1:31, then God saw everything he had made, and indeed it was very good. So the evening and the morning were the sixth day. And then Exodus 20:11, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. So I guess want to kind of wrap up there. Boy, it's been a fantastic day. I really appreciate your attention, and I apologize for going long. I can't actually talk much faster, but I didn't think you'd want to hear that all day. So, but I do appreciate you hanging here. But we're happy again to stay as late as anybody'd like. Does anybody have any questions or any discussion about anything that we covered today? Yes.
I just want to remind you that you are 1.5 times taller than that 300 meters podium.
Oh yeah, hey,
Goliath.
So you're making me feel good now. Thanks.
Just one question that came through from one of the viewers was that, Tom. Just one question is, why do we still have baboons and gorillas left if it was so-called evolution?
Right.
Wouldn't they have morphed
and,
into something else?
And so, I mean, no, that's a good. I'm trying to think of so evolution is like the Big Bang. They'll have a story for anything, and so I'm trying to think of what story they would tell for that one. Yeah, but they would. I would just say, unfortunately, they would have a story for that, and then So it's so it's an excellent question, and we. I think right now one of the ones they might say, well, we all evolved from an ape-like creature. But they'll just, again, all the reasons we talked about today, we know that didn't happen. But they'll, that's why it's so challenging. It's really to get someone to, objectively consider the Bible. And I'll just go real quick. So I had Bible-believing friends that would tell me, things that I knew they were right, and that was when I would just, I'd act like, they weren't having any effect on me. It was actually had a friend. He was the top mechanical engineering student where I was going at University of Florida at that time, and he loved talking about this. I didn't know why, and we would talk about it a lot. Well, it's because he was trying to convert me to being a Christian, and so it's and so we had a discussion, and then one night in frustration, he literally he showed me this paragraph, and it was written by a philosophy professor at another university. And it was basically a profession of faith in evolution. Okay, so I read this paragraph, and it's, the universe began in the Big Explode. I can't remember what the date was. It was, probably 13, 14, and then life evolved, plants formed. So I read this paragraph, and I'm like, yeah, we all know that's true. Who wouldn't sign that paragraph? Well, then it dawned on me that I thought, I agree with everything in that paragraph. It dawned on me my friend wouldn't sign that paragraph. And so then I started thinking, okay, wait a second. I got the top engineering student at a major university who would not be allowed to get a technical degree because a philosophy professor disagreed with him. And so that's actually what got me, because then I got mad. So I'm like, he was a really nice guy. I disagree with him, but, he's a good friend. So I actually started thinking about it. I was like, well, wait a second. That's not technical. That's not scientific. And so that's maybe, there are many things, but that might have been one moment when I started thinking, hey, I need to think about this more. So all I mean by that is, keep asking any question. Just get people to think, because you never know what will click. I literally think he probably had no idea that was, I literally just think he was just frustrated. Okay, so do you think, what do you think of this? And that actually clicks. So just be patient, be persistent, keep talking to people, see, because you never know what's going to click. And so likewise, that's an excellent question to ask. He would have, if he's talking to a friend, they'll have some story. Oh, well, that's because we both evolved from ape-like creatures. Just keep asking. Keep trying to get them to think, trying to get them to consider the Bible. So that was a good question. I wish I could. It's a good question. I'll just leave it at that. Good question. I'll just say a lot of times there'll be some canned response that they'll have memorized to questions like that. Yeah.
So a takeaway that I can get out of this is that it has almost nothing to do with the Big Bang, almost nothing to do with cosmology and all of that stuff and carbon. It seems to me it's got to do with religion.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just, if someone wants to deny God, if we want to have atheism, we being society, unfortunately, that we're in, then it's the best that people can come up with. And so, but many people get brainwashed by it. I've heard another good analogy once. If we started telling children when they were 2 years old that 2 + 2 = 5, then they'd start out saying 2 + 2 is 5, and then they might get to be first or second grade, and they'd start asking people, well, 2 and 2, it sure looks like it's 4. And if their teacher said, nah, you're just not thinking about it right, or you're not as educated as the rest of us, or or you haven't read about these great scientists, 2 + 2 is really equal to 5. Well, they might ask questions for a few years, but pretty soon, they get to be their teenage years or their high school, and they're going to go around and they'll be convinced that 2 + 2 = 5. They won't quite understand how that can work, but that's all they've been told their whole life, and how they, and so it's kind of the same thing, as ridiculous as the idea that life could just make itself, or that we don't have free will, or that a bacteria could turn itself into an animal, or an ape could turn into a human, or if we step back, or that the universe could just be a big explosion and then everything just makes itself. I mean, you step back and look at that's ridiculous. But if we're told that from a very young age, it's hard to, it's hard for people to let go of that. And so that's something that we as Christians will have to struggle with. And there's many more. It's always fun going back into like First Kings and looking at what they struggled with 3,000 years ago. It was very similar to what we're going through today. 3,000 years ago, they had very important people in their society telling them to worship Baal. And when Elijah asked them, "Are you going to believe in Baal or God?" They didn't know how to answer, because they had all this evidence for God, but they had all these important people telling them to believe in Baal. Well, we're in the same thing. We have all this evidence for God, but we're being told, no, believe the universe and everything in it just made itself. So a lot of people just aren't answering. So it's a part of the challenge. But people have to answer. We have to decide, are we going to obey the gospel and spend eternity with God, or are we going to just ignore it and spend eternity separated from God? So it's really important. It's not just an abstract question. Yeah.
I've heard that there is evidence that a meteorite has struck the Earth previously, and people think that that's what killed the dinosaurs. Do you know of this evidence? Is there in fact evidence, or is it just people saying things?
So that's another one. It kind of comes and goes. The idea was there was a crater off the Yucatan that maybe had some a higher iridium content, which would be consistent with meteors. But then there's also an osmium layer, which is very consistent with volcanic activity. And so there's a debate between a meteor, and volcanoes. And so, the fountains of the great deep, a lot of people would say, well, that would favor volcanoes. And so if you look at, about when, we think some of this extinction occurred, that osmium layer would be consistent with the fountains of the great deep. In other words, that being a lot of volcanism. But there's also, I don't believe there's anything in the Bible, but, could there have been meteors, like increased meteor bombardment or something during the flood? And so I haven't ever seen any. So that's, technically there's a debate. I think it's just even a few months ago, shifted back towards people saying, no, it was just massive volcanism, which most people would consider I shouldn't say most people, a lot of people consider more consistent with the flood, as far as just the fountains of the Great Deep. It basically, as the continent started to separate, you started out with one continent. If God used, during the flood, the continents separating, then this ocean water would have been exposed to the mantle, and that would have caused, jets of, superheated jets, which would have caused, easily caused rain for 40 days and 40 nights, oceans heating, fountains of the Great Deep as described in the Bible. So it's very biblically consistent, but there could also have been, meteor impacts as well. Yeah.
A quick question with regards to dinosaurs. People who believe in the Earth being very old say that dinosaurs were billions of years ago. If the Earth is 6,000 years old, where do dinosaurs fit into that time period? And what, what is the extinction? Were they on the Ark? That type of question.
Right. So they would have, they've been created on day 6. Just the land dinosaurs, and then, so the dinosaur fossils we see would have been buried during the flood. And so that's consistent with just the fossil graveyards we see and how the dinosaurs are buried. When their habitats were destroyed, whether they floated or sunk, after they drowned, it's just consistent with what we see in the fossil record. Then the extinction. So after the flood, the climate would have been a lot different. So that's one thing. You notice in Genesis 9:3, that's when we're told we can eat everything. And so one interpretation of that is before the flood, just the plants were so diverse. There were so many that we didn't, but then after the flood, we're told to eat everything. And so, but many, just indications, both from the Bible and elsewhere, the climate after the flood would have been a lot different. If you look at the, like when, I think it was Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the plains of the Jordan were well watered everywhere. So I was blessed to be able to go on a tour of Israel a few years ago, and boy, the last thing that comes to your mind looking at that is that it's well watered everywhere. You see a lot of desert and then a little bit, and so, but it was interesting. Our tour guide wasn't, he wasn't, anti-Christian. He wasn't pro-Christian, but he just pointed out. He said, time of the Israelites there was 2 to 3 times as much annual rainfall. Well, that's very consistent with a post-flood climate. And so that's, and that would have been the time of Lot. So, but anyway, the climate changed a lot. So it's a good chance that the plants that the dinosaurs tended to eat, I think some estimates are like 90% of those went extinct. So that would have been a stress. The climate would have been different after the flood. So that would have been a stress. People may or may not have been eating dinosaurs before the flood, but they could have, and then just fear also. If just people, things were different, and if the dinosaurs were becoming aggressive, they would start to, kill dinosaurs, just like dinosaurs or aggressive animals tend to be killed today. Then we do have a lot of paintings, petroglyphs. We have figurines, legends, a lot of things consistent with people seeing dinosaurs. A lot of people think a lot of the dragon legends, which are again very widespread, are basically centered around 1 or 2 types of dinosaurs. So we have evidence of people being aware of dinosaurs after the flood, but then just kind of multiple factors causing them to go extinct. It's just one line of reasoning, but we wouldn't know exactly why. Yeah.
I read somewhere that air bubbles caught in amber was tested and found that it had more oxygen than our air has today.
Okay.
And that many of those big dinosaurs, their nostrils were not much bigger than that of a horse, meaning that before the flood they could get oxygen easier than after the flood.
Okay.
And that could maybe be part of their extinction. The rarity of the oxygen in the new atmosphere after the flood.
Right. Okay. Yeah. No, that's a good point. Everyone here just mentioned that apparently there's some data that there was more oxygen in the atmosphere before the flood, than after the flood, and that would be, probably consistent with a higher CO2 concentration, which is still relatively low fraction of the atmosphere. Even the secular museums, I think now the ones in D.C. will say. They'll acknowledge that there were CO2 concentrations at least 15 times higher than they are today in the past. But that would also generate a lot of plant life, which would create a lot of oxygen. So that's again, just the overall the climate changing.
I don't know if I'm going to probably cover a similar question that was asked by Ashley was, what are the feasibility of life on Earth with a flat Earth and then the Earth that we know it from the Bible, which says it is, it hangs like a circle on,
Yeah. So
I see there's a resurgence of the flat Earth theory
Okay.
in our world, and it's a worry because one's just...
Yeah, I think it will. I think as more and more, so like SpaceX, of course, is launching, tourists now. I think Blue Origin is going to launch people soon. I think they've officially announced a date that's soon, so just as more and more people go into space and more people see that the Earth is round, there was an idea that maybe we didn't land on the moon, but maybe there was many ways you can address that. You can say, well, millions of people saw the Saturn V launch live with their own eyes, and just getting a rocket that large off the Earth, would be a large part of going to the moon. But now we have orbiters, going around the moon that can take pictures of the landers. So now we know there's at least landers that size on the, So I think just again as, I'm not sure why those theories take root or how, but I think as more and more people go on Earth, and I think Virgin Galactic is offering, well, I shouldn't name company names. There's companies that are going to be offering, I think, about $200,000. So if we convince our spouses to let us take out a third mortgage on the house and maybe camp for a few years and sell all the cars and so then we can go out and we can confirm for ourselves.
We check your photo.
Yeah. Oh yeah. There you go. So you'll trust me. Okay, I got you. Yeah. I'll have my tent in the background. I'll say, hey, here's what I spent my money on. So yeah. So I think those theories they'll just kind of they'll fade away.
Dissipate,
yeah. But it is. So I think our biggest concern is just make sure they don't become disunifying.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but they'll fade away. It's the same thing as.
Yeah.
But a lot of times it's good that people want to see it with their own eyes and understand it. But they'll actually have that opportunity, or at least people that they know. So.
And just to endorse that, because the folk that are leaning toward that are wonderful.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
God-fearing.
Yeah. Exactly.
And one respectfully then said, but in other words, we're implying that thousands of scientists are distorting the very evidence that they claim to base their findings on, to subvert a perceived truth that the Earth in fact is flat.
Right. Yeah, and that's
so there's a massive conspiracy.
Yeah,
implied,
and then
but
and then the again, to their credit, unfortunately, we go into a museum or go into a zoo or read in a textbook, and they'll say, "Oh yeah, we all life made itself 3.8 billion years ago, and and then bacteria turned into animals, and well, we know that's wrong."
Yeah.
And they can at least claim that there's lots of people that support that. So but it's just we have to decide. Okay, what's so to me, but that's all. It goes back to the comment. That's just because they're trying to push atheism. And there's no. And for whatever reason, that's why we still tolerate Charles Darwin, because we're trying to push atheism, and they can't. There's no. It goes against everything we know about true science, but it's the best they can do. But it's just like Baal worship 3,000 years ago. It permeates our society, and so to me that's the difference. It's not because really anyway, just a lot of these things, like there'd be no real reason to pretend we landed on the moon. Not that big of a driver, because it doesn't. When we were on Apollo 8, when we were going around the back of the moon, we read, the astronauts read out of Genesis. That was Christmas Eve. They were on the back of the moon, and they actually made a stamp of it. And it's just, and you think it's just sad, how far, we've drifted away from God. Because I used to think, every now and then you'll go online and you'll have an atheist say, "Oh, Christianity really holds us back." It's holding back science stuff. So I always like to say, well, the United States, and please, I don't mean this to sound whatever, but we were very far ahead of the rest of the world in the 1960s. I mean, we were developing computers, we were landing people on the moon. That was done by people that grew up in our public education system where they had prayer in school, where they took a Bible class, where the United States as a whole, we were very friendly towards Christianity, and so, and it was just accepted, and people worshiped God, and they knew the Bible. That was when we were, to me, that was when we were the most advanced. And not just to me, I mean, just arguably, if you wanted to say, when was the United States the furthest ahead, the most advanced, it was when we had people that grew up in that environment. We have a stamp, Postal Service stamp, in the beginning, God. That was from the Apollo 8 mission. Yeah. It's on a stamp, and this was back in the 60s. And for whatever reason, we've allowed the atheists to draw us away from that. And so we're not, to me, we're, so if anybody ever tries to make that argument, we have to become atheists because it somehow is good for science. Well, we talked about vestigial organs, junk DNA, cosmology, all the areas atheism is holding us back. But even just if you just look at what the results were, and so it's, so all that said, there's unfortunately this huge motivation by, the people, the religion that's unfortunately in control right now, to try to push evolution. So you do get a lot of fake science, things put out there to try to support that religion. But there really wasn't that for the moon. There wouldn't be for a flat Earth or a round Earth. It's just so maybe just another thing to mention is what would be the motivation. We know what the motivation is to pretend life could just make itself. Well, they want to promote atheism, or the universe just Big Bang and off it comes. They want to promote atheism, but there's no. But again, just main thing is we staying unified, and like you said, realizing they're very sincere people. And again, unfortunately, they have a right to be suspicious by a lot of the fake science that's out there. So, sorry.
Does the second law of thermodynamics disprove evolution in terms of everything is degrading over time?
Yes, so it would. So that's how one of the many ways we know the universe couldn't be infinitely old. Things degrading. Now the counter to that would be, if somehow a star could form, you have energy, coming in from that star, and so they'll say, so the energy input, things could, maybe things can organize, or you could go. So, but if you look at the universe as a whole, the second law of thermodynamics definitely applies. But the other one is it has to be directed energy, and so one of the analogies I heard is if, say the house is a mess, well, that's entropy. And so if you want to clean the house, you should just be able to open the windows and let the sun shine in, and it'll clean up. Well, so it has to be directed energy. And so there's a lot more that goes to that, but that'll be, but you're absolutely right. Second law goes against evolution, and then the counter will often be, but you have the sun. Well, then you work through, and it goes back to you can't make life from non-life and everything else. So, but no, that's a good point. Okay, sure. Okay, I love talking about this. I don't know if you've noticed, but anyway. So thank you very much for your attention today, and thank you for being here. Right, that's right. No, thank you very much, and hopefully see many of you tomorrow. We'll be,